Hi everybody. My name is Shirley Hoy. I'm a board member of IMFG. I'm absolutely delighted and honored to welcome all of you to our celebration of IMFG's 20th anniversary. What a remarkable milestone, eh? Where did 20 years go? Seeing off, it's almost like a reunion or a homecoming this afternoon. So it's going to be a very stimulating and interesting afternoon. But first of all, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge the land that we're on. We wish to acknowledge this land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional lands of the Huron-Wendat, Seneca, and most recently, the Mississaugas of the Credit. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. So, IMFG has been an essential part of raising the discourse around the financing and governance of cities, and indeed, of the whole municipal sector over the past 20 years. As the only think tank of its kind in Canada, it contributes both to the academic discourse through papers and support of graduate students, but also to the public policy landscape in how it engages government officials and policymakers on the critical issues facing municipalities. IMFG has published over 100 papers and held over 200 events in its 20-year history. It focused on timely and key topics, engaging academics and practitioners, and not just across Canada, but globally. Today, you will hear from some of IMFG's prolific contributors who have written an essay for the occasion, which reflects on topics they have written for IMFG in the past and how they will see those issues playing out for municipalities over the next 20 years. I hope you had a chance to read or at least skim those essays, which are posted at imfg.org. We'll hear from those authors today in two panel discussions, focus on first governance and then finance. You'll also hear from other leading thinkers of cities via video address. Meric Gertler, an urbanist and currently the president of the University of Toronto, could not be here in person today, but has provided a video address, as has David Miller, who I had the privilege of working with, the former mayor of the City of Toronto, and currently the managing director of C40. David has been quite engaged with IMFG over the years, and Meric's support of the Institute and the School of Cities here at U of T has been essential. I'm sure you'll enjoy hearing their thoughts on what cities will grapple with in the future. IMFG has a large extended family, which includes our authors, but also the many graduate students and postdoctoral students who have been supported by the Institute, as well as past and current staff. We'll be celebrating hearing from many of them today as well. Moderating our two panels are two former IMFG staff. Andre Cote, I haven't seen Andre. Is he here yet? He will be. Andre and Selena's here. Selena Zhang and Thomas Hatchett, another former staff, will share his reflections following our panel discussion. Many of IMFG's former graduate fellowship winners and postdoctoral fellows, and some of them are here with us today as well, are now academics or part of government and non-governmental organizations. During the reception later, you will learn more about where they are now at. I think Enid has mentored a lot of wonderful leaders for us, and we're very fortunate. Before I ask the co-founders of IMFG, Enid, Zack, and Alan, who's the director, of course, you all know, and Alan Broadbent, who's the board chair, to kick off the afternoon program for us, I just got a couple of minor housekeeping details for you. You'll see we have a very, very full agenda, 3 hours until 5 o'clock. And you may also note that we don't have a formal break time in the agenda. So we welcome you to use the facilities when you need to. The restrooms are downstairs, but just leave the room quietly when you have to leave. But we wanted to make sure we get through our full agenda. So without further ado then, I'm now going to turn it over to Enid and Alan to start the conversation and tell us how and why they began IMFG, and whether they had a walk in the snow before they made up that decision. So over to you, Alan and Enid.
Wow, I just want to say before we start, it's fabulous to see you all. It does feel like a homecoming, a reunion, and it's just so wonderful to see all the people who've touched IMFG, or who IMFG has touched over the last 20 years. So thank you for coming and welcome. Alan, 20 years.
20
Was it a
years.
walk in the park, a walk in the snow?
Well, I just echo the appreciation for all of you being here. And just to let you know, Enid and I get along extremely well. We're told to sit one chair apart. So we're just, I guess, for among the first time ever following the rules. That's good. So we thought what Enid and I could do with just a very brief explanation of why we founded the Institute, what we were thinking, and a little bit of the early journey of doing that. And Enid, of course, was well known in urban circles and had been involved in most of the events and activities around the place of cities, particularly in this region, both in Who Does What and the Golden Report, a whole bunch of different things. And she and I had been involved together in a number of those things and subsequent things. And Enid was always there as the person who who had expertise around finance, and particularly around municipal finance. And you know, I always found that really instructive for me. And when I would talk to Enid and say, well, who else is out there? It would be, well, there's not too many others out there. And the more I started to pay attention to this, realized that there was a huge gap in the discourse and a huge gap in the research and the available literature around municipal finance. And so many of the things that we talked about in those various efforts had to do with how do we untangle what is really a governmental structure that's so far out of step with the needs of the cities in Canada, but of the nation as a whole. And if you have a gap in the finance part of it, which I think is really the spine on which so much of the rest of it hangs, you have a huge gap. And so when these discussions were going on and it would come to issues of finance and Enid would describe the architecture of it, people would very often just take a very resigned position and say, well, I guess we just have to hope from some kind of manna from heaven, you know, constitutional reform seems to be so hard in this, et cetera, et cetera. This is a very engaged audience with all these issues. You know all of these responses, and you won't be surprised by that. And our mutual friend and my colleague at the time, Mary Rowe, who is now head of the Canadian Urban Institute, she and I had worked together for a long time around, worked with Jane Jacobs, who we were both close to, around creating an event around Jane's work, and subsequently around an effort to the C5 mayor's effort to try and identify some way to change this paradigm that we seem to be locked into. And so Mary and I thought, well, why don't we create that center? If there is a gap here, why don't we try and fill that gap? Why don't we try and figure that out? And of course, we have to talk to Enid if we want to do that, because we're not going to do that without Enid being engaged in it. And you know, we'd had experience at Maitrey in creating organizations to fill gaps, the Caledon Institute of Social Policy, the Tamarack Institute for Community Engagement, and we thought that creating one around municipal finance would be a similarly you know, constructive idea. And so we talked, I think Enid, originally it was you having coffee with Mary and Mary raising this with you, and talked about creating this organization. And some of the basic things we wanted to make sure we do was to do the research in order to fill some of that, to write and have people write for the Institute to help create a body of literature around these issues, to convene, to have this kind of event and the other events we've had in order to get people involved in the discourse and to hear the nuances of argument and the ideas, and then to advocate in a subtle way and in a non-controversial way, but to make sure that these ideas just didn't become locked in a closed-loop conversation, but would actually affect the public discourse around the place of cities. And so that's what we decided to do. And then the other thing that Enid thought was really important, which I'm sure she'll talk about, is we wanted to have something that could bring younger people through, to bring students through, to get people academically studying this, but also people interested in going into municipal governments or other organizations with a knowledge of municipal finance and how it's distinctive from other levels of public finance. So those were the essential design elements, and that's what we did.
That's what we did. Well, perhaps I'll talk a little bit about my own personal journey. If we go back 20 years, I was an economic consultant. I had my own consulting company, and I had been practicing for about 20 years at that time, and my clients were largely governments, some private sector, some international organizations. And I was increasingly frustrated in that role for a couple of reasons. And the first one was that, you know, when you're a consultant, and I'm sure there's some of you out there, you kind of have to go where the money is, and you have to answer the questions that people are asking you. And I just didn't find the questions that good, right? I thought there were more important public policy issues that we should be thinking about, that we should be looking at. And I see Howard Chernick is here from CUNY in New York. Howard was doing work on fiscal health of cities a long time ago. I don't want to age you, but it was a while ago. And I thought, why aren't we looking at the fiscal health of cities? Don't we need to know if cities can manage to meet their expenditure requirements with the revenues do they have? And are they sustainable going into the future? But nobody was asking those questions, and I felt we really for the public policy discourse, needed to look at those kinds of questions. The second frustration for me, and Alan kind of hinted at it, was that there weren't a lot of people in this field. And you know, many of you have heard me tell this joke before, but you know, people would say to me, are you one of the top municipal finance economists in Canada? And I would say, oh yes. And they'd say, oh boy, you're really arrogant. And I go, well no, there actually are only 5. And you know, and it is funny, and we're all laughing, but it isn't funny, because we really, you know, needed and you know, always need more people looking at these issues in municipal finance. And so setting up an institute like this at the university allowed us to do both things, to actually define some of the policy questions that we thought were important, but also to bring in others, and particularly younger people, to work on municipal finance issues, and we could do that through fellowships to students in economics, political science, public policy, geography, engineering. They came from everywhere. So then I didn't have a coffee with Mary. I actually had pho at a Vietnamese restaurant on Bloor Street. And I described all my frustrations to her. And she said, funny you should mention all that. because Alan and I have been talking about something similar. And so that's how we formed the Institute in December of 2024. Lots of 2004. It is 2024. Yeah, sorry about that. Thank you. Back in 2004, 20 years ago. We had help along the way, and I want to do a shout out to Richard Bird, who is mentioned in the program. Many of you knew Richard. He was a professor of economics at the University of Toronto, but much better known around the world than here in Canada for the work he did on public finance and development. I was very fortunate that he was my thesis supervisor in the 1970s, and we stayed colleagues and friends until he died. As a matter of fact, the day he died, we were working on 2 projects together. But I went to him early on, and a little bit, because he had been my professor, with a little bit of trepidation, saying, we're thinking of setting up this institute. And he just said, wow, that's fantastic. He said, this is what Canada needs, because we always talk about federal finance. We write about federal finance. We do very little on provincial and municipal finance. This is exactly what we need. I'm here for you, anything you need. And he did everything. He mentored students. He wrote papers. I mean, he wrote the first IMFG paper. I think I wrote the second. And he was very engaged in all of the work we did. And I remember at the beginning having lunch with him. You think that's all I do is have lunches with people. And I said, I'm in a panic. I said I would do 2 papers by international authors, and I don't know what to do. And by the next day, we had 2 international authors agreeing because Richard had reached out to them. So, you know, we've had a lot of help along the way. We started very small with just doing some papers, which turned into the IMFG Papers on Municipal Finance and Governance series. But then we branched out to Perspectives papers, which were a little more, well, I think all our work is accessible, but a little lighter, you know, more graphics, shorter. Then we went into forum papers. So when we'd have an event, we would write up a forum paper. And most recently, the Who Does What series that you're all familiar with, and we may talk about that a little bit more later. But these are all because of our staff who came up with these ideas to branch out into all these different areas. So we started with papers, we expanded the paper series. Apparently we had 200 public events. I hadn't counted them, but we've had a lot of public events like this one, and we video them so they're all on our website. Now we're live streaming them. We had roundtables, which some of you know about, some of you may not. But we often bring together a small group of people to have an off-the-record Chatham House rule discussion about particular issues. And it may be helping the provincial government, it may be helping the municipalities to talk about issues where they could use some academic expertise or some practitioner expertise. And it's all off the record, and we try to get people's best views, not their organization's views, but their own views about different issues. And those are extremely rewarding roundtables. We support students through graduate fellowships and postdoctoral fellowships. And then we bring in visiting scholars from people around the world. We've had people from Ireland, the UK, Norway, the US, Switzerland, and I could go on. And some of them are on the live stream today, I noticed. So that's basically what we have been doing for the last 20 years.
Yeah, and I think we've had some pretty good impact. And I think it's maybe, you know, we're ambitious about what we thought we wanted to achieve, and perhaps haven't achieved all of the things that we wanted to. You know, very often politicians with a finger in the wind are not going to want to listen to the architecture of municipal finance or some of these other critical elements of, you know, how much leeway they actually have to do things or what's possible. And I could go on for a long time in that, but I won't. But, you know, if somebody has their finger in the wind and you want the wind, them to perceive the wind coming from a certain direction, you try and create some wind, right? You try and be the source of that wind, and I think we have tried to do that with some success. The voices for change in something as complex as how city regions and cities work are scattered. They don't always correlate with each other, so We have tried to correlate, and I think have done that with some success. That remains a challenge, and far beyond just what we can do, but remains a challenge. You know, governments move slowly on fundamental change, and we know that, and there's very good reasons for that. It's actually a good idea in many cases. It's actually not a great idea sometimes, and so you try and collapse those time frames, get them to move more quickly, and I think we have played a role in doing that in a number of places. Part of the upside, I would think, is that we've had tremendous engagement with the Institute from senior municipal public service leaders. And I'm talking about the CAOs and city managers and senior managers, finance officials. I've come away with the impression that these are extremely competent people doing probably at least as competent as any level of government in Canada, the leadership in those areas. And they're engaged with this. They want to find out, they want to learn about stuff that's critical to their work and their leadership, and our ability to help them. As Enid said, we do very often these convenings for them, these private closed convenings, by invitation convenings, to bring expertise to the issues that they would like to learn more about, they need to know about. And we can be a safe place for them to engage in that kind of thing, and I think that's been very helpful. And the other area, I think, is that you know, our effort to bring young scholars through, I think, has been successful. I'm not sure it's been as successful as we would like it to have been, and I think there's lots of work not only for us to do, but we were talking earlier, some of us, about how they're now in positions where they're bringing students through in their academic places, or they're in municipal governments and bringing people in and them taking some of that, picking up some of that obligation, some of that onus, I think is important, and they're doing that. I'm persuaded they're interested in doing that and doing that. So I think part of what we have tried to do, and I think we'll continue to try to do, is to create this, create the wind for change and for progressing on some of these issues, and that's kind of why we did it in the first place, and why it remains not only an ongoing challenge and work to do, but why it's interesting and why it's fun for us to be able to do this.
Well, no, I agree. I certainly agree with all that. And, you know, we've had some success stories. We move the needle now and again. I mean, I did hear a federal minister out west saying, we need to figure out who does what and how to pay for it. I thought, wow, he's read something I've written, I think. And all the series of papers we did at IMFG on who does what. But, you know, we have all these papers that we have produced. We used to produce them in hard copy. I really like that, but they're now all online. But, you know, I'm told that universities across the country, this is reading list material, because there's nothing else in Canada on these topics. And so we're on the curriculum of a lot of courses. And I see lots of people nodding in the audience. And of course, our papers are read by government officials. I've been told by certain ministries when our stuff comes out, it's mandatory reading. That's not to say people do what we say, but we are elevating the debate. We're at least providing the information so that people understand if they're doing it, why. If they're not doing it, well, they have their reasons, as Alan said. We've got a lot of media, as you know. Our authors are always called, and I am called. I was called today about the City of Toronto budget. I declined, only because I was here. But we get called regularly, you know, to be on TV. We're quoted in the newspapers on the research that we're doing. And, you know, the proudest thing, I think, for me, and I think I can speak for Alan, and he's talked about this, is the influence of our staff and fellowship winners in terms of what they are now doing. We've got people in academia, great academic jobs in Canada, the US, in Europe, in Asia, people at universities in all parts of the world who came through here and did a postdoc, and that experience was considered pretty good and let them go on to other things. People are in government, in nonprofit organizations, international organizations. And so we feel like our tentacles are spreading around the world in different policy circles. So when you come to the reception, after we're finished here and the reception is outside, you're going to see a screen, and it's going to show where a lot of our people are, where they've ended up, what universities or what jobs they're in, and many of them have written about their experience at IMFG, and it'll be flipping along with pictures of earlier events. Many of you will be in those pictures, so you must look for yourself. And I think you will enjoy seeing the reach. We certainly enjoy seeing the reach that we have had. So with that, I'm going to turn the podium over to one of our stars at IMFG, who was our manager of program and research for a number of years, and that is Selena Zhang. Please welcome Selena.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. My name's Selena Zhang. I was the manager of programs and research at IMFG over a decade ago, although sometimes it feels like it was just yesterday. Being at the Institute is a little bit of a Hotel California situation. You know, you can check out, but you never really leave. In my case, the ideas and experiences that I gained here really became a lens that I carry with me everywhere I go. And as we reflect on 2 decades of the Institute's work and think about the next 2 decades ahead, you know, it's striking to me how the past always feels present and the future, in many ways right now, feels like it's already here. I was thinking the other day about the work of one of our former IMFG graduate fellows, who is here today, Zack. When he was a graduate fellow with the Institute, his research was about Detroit and fiscal equalization as a solution to the hollowing out of the city's finances after the collapse of the auto industry. And I remember talking to him and him describing this really visceral experience of sitting on a bus, sort of driving through the city and hearing the tree branches, which hadn't been trimmed, sort of scraping along the sides of the vehicle. And things like that sort of inspiring his research inquiry and now successful career in city finance. And I was thinking about him because in the days after the American election, like many of us, in a state of delirium and mourning and confusion, I found myself spending a ton of time listening to American activists and organizers who themselves were looking for explanations and coming together to organize for the coming resistance. And among those voices was a longtime organizer named Jeff Ordauer, who has been an advocate for workers' rights for many decades in the American Midwest. And he was telling a very similar story about these former logging towns in places like Oregon, where industry had dried up and local governments were had gone bankrupt, and in these critical moments left them unable to deliver even basic services like staffing 911 calls 24 hours a day. And he talked about how in some cases into that vacuum stepped right-wing militia groups who started hiring sheriffs and volunteers to staff things like emergency services. And he reminded us in these conversations that in lots of places, parts of the right-wing coalition weren't just spreading divisive and racist dog-whistling messages, although they were doing that too. They were also speaking to a people who felt left behind by institutions that were meant to serve them. And it was this really powerful reminder in these conversations about the consequences of governance failure and a testament to the importance of places like this, that places like IMFGs that are always thinking about the need for resilient public systems that continue to meet the needs of our communities and meet them where they are. This happens to me a lot. You know, I'll be flipping through my phone and seeing, you know, the most recent devastating images of wildfires and storms and floods, and I'll think about the panel of chief resilience officers that we pulled together to talk about how cities are at the forefront of building a resilient future. Or, you know, last month when the city of Toronto released its framework for inclusive economic development, I was reminded of Dina Grazer, who is here today as well, and Pamela Robinson's really compelling paper on fiscal trust, and how the ingredients of that recipe between local governments and the people that they serve and represent. The Institute has this remarkable way of staying out of the fray, but always in the frame. It stays out of the headlines, but it helps us really to understand them. So with that, I'm going to invite or introduce you to our first panel. We're going to talk about local governance, and these folks are so much smarter than me, and they're going to share their analysis of the last 20 years and the next 20 years. And honestly, if IMFG is a Hotel California, then these folks are part of that motley crew of band members. But we all need to remember that even when you go on to your solo career, you know, the songs that you write here continue to be some of your greatest hits. So to kick things off, we have some video remarks from Meric Gertler, and then I'm going to invite my colleagues Alex Flynn, Zack Taylor, and Gabe Eidelman to the stage, and then afterwards we're going to hear from Zach Spicer. So over to the screen and Meric Gertler.
Hello, everyone. I'm sorry that my international travel commitments prevent me from joining you on this auspicious occasion. Let me begin by extending my warmest congratulations to the Institute on Municipal Finance and Governance on reaching this impressive milestone. For 2 decades, the Institute has been a vital source of research and expertise, and a key forum for thoughtful, engaged debate on important urban issues in Canada and beyond. As we look ahead to the next 20 years, major trends on the horizon will only further elevate the importance of cities and municipal governance. This means that the work of IMFG will only become more urgent and timely. On the international scale, geopolitical tensions are impeding our ability to tackle many pressing global issues. This is most evident in the case of climate change, where multilateral action towards even modest goals seems out of reach, while our planet verges on a climate emergency. Given this global gridlock, progress must come increasingly from local actors, including municipalities. Indeed, many cities across Canada and around the world are taking active steps to address climate change, along with other urban actors such as universities. Cities are also increasingly called upon to take the lead in addressing other pressing issues, such as housing affordability, transportation, social exclusion, and the successful integration of newcomers from abroad. And yet, there is an undeniable tension between the compelling logic for urban action and the degree to which we empower or constrain local actors. In Canada, as this audience knows well, cities remain constitutional creatures of the provinces, so their ability to act effectively to address our most pressing challenges is fundamentally compromised. Indeed, in many cases, provinces fail to equip their cities with the tools they need to tackle those issues. In short, municipalities are having to assume leadership roles in addressing matters of national or global significance, while at the same time finding their authority or the means to enable this important work being restricted or diminished. Reconciling this tension will be a looming challenge for our municipalities and for the senior levels of government that shape the wider institutional context. This will not be an easy task. Its resolution will depend on persuasive analysis and evidence-based arguments. Of course, if any group can help find the way forward, it is the Institute on Municipal Finance and Governance that we are celebrating today. Once again, congratulations on your 20th anniversary, and thank you for letting me share these brief remarks.
Okay, I'm going to invite my colleagues to join me on the stage. Zach, Alex, and Gabe. Okay, so we decided on an order. So Zach, I'm going to turn it over to you first. As you look at the landscape of local governance today, where do you see the biggest gaps and opportunities?
I think I want to start by just talking about my own trajectory through IMFG. IMFG at 10 does not feel like it was 10 years ago, Enid. It's it feels like yesterday. And a dozen years before that, when I sat in your class doing my master's degree in planning here at University of Toronto, and you were teaching the municipal finance course, that feels like yesterday too. But so much has happened in the meantime. I mean, I was a graduate fellow at IMFG, ended up getting a faculty position, writing 3 reports. It's been a great privilege to be part of this and to be part of this community. I see so many familiar faces in the audience who've been part of this experience over the years. So what kind of future do we want in 20 years? I mean, I think we want cities that will be equitable, will be environmentally sustainable, will create economic opportunities for people. And we want local governments to govern those places, right? And we want those local governments to be creative. We want them to have the capacity to be creative, to devise policy solutions. They need to have capabilities. We want them to be democratically responsive. We want them to be inclusive. In order to bring about these things we want, we need a vital and vibrant local government. But as we talk about that, we also need constructive engagement from other levels of government, right? We can't just talk about local government alone. Places are governed by lots of governments in our system. And potentially, what those different levels of government offer to places is complementary, right? And those resources can be pooled. So I think in the next 20 years, the configuration of local government and finance will change much as it has changed over the last 20 years. I think we often invoke the idea that we have an ossified system, a system that's incapable of change. But lots have changed, right? My IMFG paper on legal frameworks for local government found that in the previous 25 years, we've actually had a quiet revolution in the way local legal authorization is structured in provincial legislation. Is it enough? Could it go further? Maybe, right? And we need to keep having those conversations. Metropolitan governance. We have seen over the past 25 years all kinds of experimentation all the way across the country in the way that metropolitan areas are governed. We may see it the least in Toronto, and because we're sitting here in Toronto, and we have Toronto goggles on a lot of the time, right, in this community, we may not be aware of that. But a lot is going on elsewhere in the country, and we need to pay attention to those things. So in terms of the future trends, I mean, obviously, the problem of infrastructure renewal and expansion is a big deal, and Maddie's going to talk about that later, I imagine. One of the things that we're seeing increasingly and will continue to see is greater involvement of municipalities in social services and public health matters. Things that are not part of their job description necessarily, things that are not part of their legal remit or responsibilities, but we are seeing municipalities all the way across the country that are at the front line of homelessness and opioid crisis response. They're doing things that are not on the black and white of the law, but are extremely important, and we need to, I think that will continue to grow. The other thing is, we're going to have more big cities. Because of the way that federal immigration policy has changed through provincial nominee and municipal nominee programs, that kind of thing, we are seeing a much smaller proportion of international immigrants move to the big 3 cities than we did a decade ago. Things are spreading out, right? Places like where I live now, London, Ontario, London's about 400,000 people now. The Ontario Ministry of Finance is predicting that it'll be 750,000 people in only 25 years, a near doubling of its size. And that's happening all the way across the country, places like Halifax, even places like Regina and Saskatoon that Torontonians never think about, right? Or Calgary and Edmonton are going to go from 1.2 million, 1.5 million to being 2 million, 2.5 million places. So we need to have a broader perspective on urbanism in this country. We need to look beyond the GTA and beyond the big three, right, of Toronto, Montreal, Vancouver. There are many other issues that are piling up, right? And I think talking to friends of mine in Halifax, which experiences both sea level rise and wildfires, right? And people in Vancouver, right, are experiencing all kinds of climate-related problems. We see extreme weather events where I live in southwestern Ontario. This stuff's only going to get more intense, and it's going to have a major fiscal impact when it comes to things like insuring stuff, liability, replacement of infrastructure that gets destroyed and that kind of thing. That's going to be a bigger issue. And addressing all these issues is going to require more than strong, robust, creative, capable local governments. It's going to require multi-level governance of urban spaces. It's going to require an active and engaged, constructively active and engaged federal and provincial governments and territorial governments. And so we need to think about that. So moving back to IMFG, what is IMFG's future in the next 20 years? Well, it needs to do everything that it's currently doing. It needs to continue to nurture a new generation of scholars within the university and practitioners outside it. I look at the group of people in this room, and many of them are people who I saw at these events 20 years ago, and I hope that there will be a new generation that will come, as I am long since no longer the new generation, right? I'm becoming the old generation. I think that IMFG can do new things that it isn't already doing. I think it can have more of a national perspective and less of a Toronto, GTA, Ontario perspective. I think it can expand its focus beyond big cities. The M is for municipal. There's 3,500 municipalities in this country, and they do lots of things. Smaller ones do less things, but they still do things, and they're still democratically accountable governments. I also think that IMFG could stake out a role in creating bases of evidence that governments and scholars can use to answer important questions. So moving beyond publishing research papers, moving beyond convening conversations among experts and practitioners, and actually start becoming the custodian of national data sets, right, that can be used. So I've applied for a grant with Enid as a partner that I hope will come true to collect national fiscal data about municipalities in which 80% of the Canadian population lives. And that will enable us to answer questions we could never answer before. And I hope that's like a foundation of something that we can grow, right, to create a base of evidence for policy making and greater understandings. The last thing I'll say is that Enid does a lot of international consulting and interacting with people around the world as an individual. But I think IMFG could become a more engaged Canadian partner in international projects in an academic sense. And there's a lot of potential to try to understand what makes us different, what makes us the same as other places, how are problems the same, how might solutions be transferable, and so on. I think there's a lot more that we could do in that way. So I'm super happy to be here and celebrate this 20th anniversary. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Zack. Thank you, Zack. Thank you for starting us off on a very hopeful and broad note around change and what's possible for cities in the next 2 decades. And I'll pick up on one of the threads around multi-level governance and maybe segue that to turn over to Alex. Another really important topic is around the relationships between municipal governments and Indigenous nations and Indigenous governments. So love to hear your perspectives on those dynamics, how things are evolving, what's working, what's needed. Over to you.
Thanks, Selena, and thank you all so much for being here. Thank you, Enid. I flew here from Vancouver yesterday, and while I was on the plane, I was reflecting on what an honor it's been to be part of IMFG. I started at U of T, I guess it would have been 2016, and Enid was one of the first people who reached out and invited me to take part in IMFG activities, which I already had been. I'd been at the City of Toronto before moving into academia, so knew it well. But one of the most amazing qualities that Enid has is to say, like, what do you want to write about? What are you interested in? And the thing that I wanted to write about was Indigenous municipal relationships. And that was very much linked to my own story, my own history. I grew up in northern Indigenous communities. We're all part of Indigenous communities, of course. The ones that I grew up in were governed by First Nations. And my passion is cities and city governance, but I had to reconcile for myself what the relationship was between Indigenous communities and municipalities was, because for so long, municipalities have claimed authority over spaces, the same spaces that Indigenous people have been historically and currently pushed away from. And so when I proposed this to Enid, she said, oh, okay, we all know that. That answer that Enid gives, like, okay, sure, write a one-page proposal and we'll see where it goes. And that formed the foundation of what would become a big project that I worked on for a number of years, trying to understand what is in fact a really complex legal policy and relational structure that we have in Canada. And the truth is, we've come a really long way in 20 years. 20 years ago, 2005, the City of Toronto Act was being negotiated, as you know. It was a totally different landscape in some ways with municipalities. And that was true of Indigenous municipal relationships as well. And seeing where we're at now, I think for most of us, if I asked you, are you aware of the fact that your city, wherever you live, is on Indigenous lands? I think most of you would raise your hands. Many of you would even know what First Nations are the Indigenous lands upon which you're at. Land acknowledgements are much more commonplace. And so that kind of first level of awareness is a game changer 20 years later. We know that we share space with municipalities and Indigenous peoples. They are in the same spaces. And the very first step of acknowledgement, I think for the most part across the country, has happened. So where are we going to go to next? That's the more difficult conversation, I think. How do we move forward from land acknowledgements just being something that we say to actual changes in governance? And we're seeing some echoes of that, some ideas that are emerging, particularly out west where I now live, where there's co-management. There are more and more governance structures that have changed, where there's offices in municipalities that specifically engage with First Nations as governmental partners. They're often housed as intergovernmental relationships. And then to the next step, which is almost like finance. What does that mean in terms of sharing fiscal relationships with First Nations? It's those two elements, the governance and the finance, that will be the future. The truth is, we don't really know what's going to happen anywhere with municipalities. We couldn't have predicted, I think, that some of the Groundhog Day situations that we're seeing with municipalities would be where we're at now. I don't know if any of us could have anticipated a Doug Ford coming in and taking over bike lanes. I was just chatting with the CBC this morning about municipalities wanting to push issues related to homelessness entirely to the province. Of course, that's happening here as well. So there's things we can't know about what's going to take place. But when it comes to Indigenous municipal relationships, there I feel more clarity, and it's largely because the legal landscape of Indigenous relationships with all governments is changing. I think that municipal governments will increasingly have to change their governance and fiscal relationships with First Nations. And I think that's a good thing, to be honest. I think there will be even more innovative solutions to things like climate change, to things like belonging, to things like housing, if we lean into, as municipal officials, as many of us in the room are, as people interested in the capacity of municipalities to address all of the crises that Zack just outlined. I think leaning into the lessons that can be learned from First Nations on how to do that in a better way, in a multi-generational way, is something to embrace. So I'll end there and look forward to the next questions.
Thank you, Alex. Okay, well then, Gabe, over to you for the perennial question of who does what.
Spoiler, I don't know yet, and that's part of this series. First off, let me just say thank you for inviting me to your birthday party. Everybody enjoys birthday parties. I'm planning one for my daughter this weekend, so it's on my mind. And one of the special parts of any birthday party is seeing people you care about, your family, kind of grow, and seeing, reminiscing great memories and how people grow and evolve. And so I feel this way about IMFG. I feel this way about my fellow panelists here, and seeing how everyone's career has grown and just getting to know everyone on that basis. I've been really blessed to be part of IMFG for a while now. Enid was mentioning some of those graduate fellowships. I was honored to receive the Blanche and Sandy Van Ginkel graduate fellowship back in 2011 for my PhD research. Another winner over here. And so, those have impact. Those are real impactful fellowships, and I'm really grateful for that. And since then, I've gone on to be a part of several reports and panels, 3 reports, and I just want to give shout outs to my co-authors in those circumstances as well. So Andre Cote, who I think snuck in there, and Michael Fenn. We wrote a paper a while back on voluntary regionalism in the GTA. Enid, of course, and Thomas looking at cost-sharing arrangements in Ontario. And I have a paper in press right now. Where's Piali? I owe you reviews of proofs right this moment. It's in my inbox. I'm getting to it. That's a paper that I've just co-authored with Jen Nellis on mayoral collaboration in the GTA during the pandemic, so watch out for that one. Even during an IMFG event, IMFG is working in the background to produce more and more. And it's been a pleasure to be on some of these panels in the past, whether it's on strong mayors or building a better budget process. And I wanted to also highlight those roundtables that Enid was mentioning, that I've had a privilege of sitting in on a couple of those, where I've learned that Chatham House rules should really be called Enid's House rules.
Yes.
Because I have never seen someone so expert in their facilitation and sharing skills as what I've witnessed in those roundtables. So that was a real treat. But certainly my longest running involvement with IMFG, I think, has been the last few years of helping this project, the Who Does What report series, which Enid asked me to kind of reflect on a little bit today and hopefully spark some conversation about where we go next. And for those of you that haven't read the whole series in full, basically boils down to that title, Who Does What, trying to get a sense of what is the role of municipalities and local government in this puzzle that is Canadian federalism. And it's a very simple question, but part of the reason why we started this series is that it's not a simple question to answer. And I would, just from a personal perspective, being in the front of the classroom, and I'm sure we felt this oftentimes, we get questions from students saying, which municipalities are involved in providing social housing, or how many run their own transit agencies, et cetera. And I, year after year, would have trouble, honestly, answering these questions with certainty, as we often do at the front of the room. Sometimes we project confidence, but then we would run home and scramble to get that right. And so I wanted a resource, and I want to create a resource with the rest of the team that we could refer students to, because I'm always thinking about how to bring IMFG's work into the classroom, and I'll come back to that, to get a clear picture about the role of municipalities in all these different policy areas. And as we started asking these questions, we realized that, there's a lot of different policy areas that we need to be thinking about when we're trying to zero in on what is the role of local government and municipal government in these different areas. So we, so far, have published 9 papers. Hopefully you've been following along. And I brought notes today because it's a long list here, and I want to make sure we have everything, including the authors that I want to mention in a moment. I'm not going to list all of them, but the ones in the room at least. So we have papers on housing, on economic development, on climate policy, on public health, on policing, on transportation, on long-term care, on childcare, on immigration, and another 2 papers on the way on mental health and addictions, and on Indigenous governance and the role and relationship between municipal governments and Indigenous governments. So it's a long list. And what I love about this series is that it brings together everything Enid and Alan were talking about before, where we have students involved, we have academics involved, and we have practitioners involved. So each paper in this series starts off with a backgrounder that I co-author, along with the editors, with students from here in the Monk School and the Urban Policy Lab here who've been involved and get a chance to really kind of sink their teeth into trying to understand this. And then we pass it over to our expert contributors, and the total now is 18 academics and 26 different practitioners that have contributed to this series from across the country. And we've really tried to make sure that we are getting representation from across the country, to your point, Zach, of trying to expand beyond the GTA. So I think some of the folks are in the room today. I just want to give a shout out to Shauna Braille, Alex Finn, of course, who was part of the housing paper, Greg Sutter, Patricia Wood, Shirley Hoy was one of our authors as well. So thank you for all the contributions, and to everyone else as well. And what the experts bring to these papers on these various topics is not just a partial answer, at least, to who does what, but also who should do what. And that's really kind of getting at the question of where do we go next. So just to summarize what I've learned from those contributions. One is, and this was, in one sense a surprise, but in another sense not so much, because we did start the series this way, but it was intriguing to me that local governments do play at least some role in all of these different areas. I was expecting that in some circumstances the reports would come back and the contributors say, actually, there's not much in it for local governments here. And so what we found was across the country, local governments play at least some role in nearly every major policy area. Now that varies from place to place. Varies province to province, as we learned from Zack's paper, of course, with the different kind of legal arrangements, right? But it is absolutely the case that there is a role, and a conversation should be had about the role of local government across the country, no matter where you are. In some areas, obviously, that role is much larger than others. Economic development across the board, major role. Transportation, policing, we saw that in our reports. In other areas, it gets a little bit messy. Ontario is the, perpetual exception here, where the list of municipal responsibilities is longer, right? And things like public health and long-term care and child care services. We didn't see that across the country, but it was important just empirically to be able to kind of confirm that. Because it's one thing to lay out the legal frameworks that would allow municipalities to do that, but we also were trying to get a sense of municipal agency. How much are they actually involving themselves and pursuing policies and other activities in these areas, whether or not there's a legal framework that either encourages or mandates them to do so. Then we picked up on various domains where there's it's remarkable how uneven municipal engagement and activity is in these areas. On immigration, for example, across the country, really different sense, whether it's large or small municipalities or in different parts of the country, of how municipalities are involved on the immigration file. On the housing file, lots of variation. For good or bad, and then obviously on climate as well, remarkably uneven. And yet, the second theme coming out of the paper is when I tried to review it all, and it took me a while, was that despite all this variation, if not all, most of our authors were actually quite optimistic that there is a greater role that municipalities can play in almost all of these areas, right? So Alex was, in your paper you were mentioning how local government can do more to acquire land for supportive housing and other not-for-profit housing initiatives, right? To my surprise, the childcare paper, all of our authors were saying, despite the fact that outside Ontario, less than 1% of all municipalities are involved in actually operating and delivering childcare services, there is a role for local governments across the country to be involved in our national childcare framework. However, and this is a final point before I conclude again on a personal note, the theme, and we already heard this, is all contingent on intergovernmental relations, right? And figuring out whether it's a forum or, as I call it, an intergovernmental infrastructure to make this work, right? And as I often joke, right now, the way that municipalities are involved, and I hope this doesn't offend anyone, but our intergovernmental forums really boil down to either a bear pit of some sort, right, where you have these kind of broad AGMs, or one-to-one coffee chats, and you get a photo op out of it, rather than kind of a more sustained intergovernmental system. And so throughout the reports, we see all kinds of interesting ideas and suggestions of what a new intergovernmental infrastructure would look like and should look like. And IMFG has written on this. Thomas has written a couple of great papers on this that I always pick up and reread to try to think through what that looks like. And so maybe that's something to kind of leave this room thinking about as I conclude my remarks, because that is another 20 years of research that that IMFG could spearhead. In the meantime, though, just to end off, I just want to say a final word of thanks here to everyone involved at IMFG. Again, as I said, the production team, Piali, Philippa I've never met in person, but I really want to. Because of Philippa, thank you for all the editorial assistance over the years. Philippa is just this kind of, as the authors know, Philippa is just the person who gives you the bright ideas of how to make your papers better at the end of that editorial process. Shout out to all of the program and research managers over the years. Again, I need notes because there's been so many, but they've all been so wonderful. So not just Selena, not just Andre, but Thomas and Cass and Dina pinching in as well, and most recently Shonali, of course, as well. To Alan, to Karen Chappell recently for helping support IMFG, and all of you for supporting IMFG over the years. And obviously, most of all, to Enid for being a small but mighty engine that drives this ship and makes IMFG such a wonderful place. And you weren't kidding. If not for Enid and IMFG, I would literally have nothing to assign in my courses. All of my syllabi are just IMFG papers. And so thank you on a very personal, selfish level for allowing me to build those courses out. So thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Gabe. So across the panel, we've talked about a lot. And now to do the almost impossible, respond to that in 5 to 7 minutes, I'm going to call up Zack Spicer. No pressure at all, Zack. But what stood out to you? What do we need to push further? What are your thoughts on all of this?
Perfect. Yeah, thanks so much. I have some very scattered notes here, so I will do my absolute best to bring a bit of coherence to this. So first off, just thanks for having me. It's a wonderful pleasure to be here to help celebrate this incredible milestone with you. So thanks for that. And of course, thanks for allowing me to read these three fantastic essays and kind of reflect on the content in them and of course where they're going in the next 20 years in each of these three policy spaces. So I guess I'll kind of go in reverse order. Start with Gabe and the big question: who does what, and who ought to do what, and who's not doing what, which I think is a crucially important question. One of the key findings from the series, and I think if you haven't had a chance to read it, I highly recommend it. It's on my syllabus too, so check it out. But one of the key findings here is that municipalities want to do more. They have the capacity to do more, and they're expected to do more. But you bump up into that kind of money wall, right? Is that how can we do more without more resources, right? You hear a lot about the municipal spending problem, right? And I think a lot of mayors and councillors would say we certainly have a spending problem. We're spending a lot more on things the province ought to be spending money on, right? So I guess that kind of brings me to what does the next 20 years look like, and that's a fantastic question. In a previous life between IMFG gigs, I worked for the Ministry of Municipal Affairs and Housing, and we would hear a lot about different challenges that municipalities, large and small, across the province were experiencing on a daily basis. And one of our saving graces from a provincial perspective was that municipalities are really good at dealing with problems. They're consistent, and that there's always someone who's very experienced and creative who is holding these organizations together with glue and popsicle sticks, and just kind of holding this ship together as it's kind of going through. With that said, there is this kind of experience gap happening, right? That I think all of your programs are producing really smart and bright students who are willing to take on some of these challenges. We have a lot of these folks who've been here for 20 years kind of holding the ship together, who are headed for the door. So we have experience gap, and I think that that's going to mean that we're going to see some things break, right? And are we going to get to a conversation voluntarily about who does what? I don't know if the province is really willing to do that, but I think it's going to be forced upon us at some time, right? So when it does happen, thankfully we have a whole series of papers to guide that conversation. But with that said, I think something is going to happen where we are kind of forced to it. In sort of fancy social science talk, we call that a punctuated equilibrium, right? These sort of periods of stability with sort of periods of dramatic change. And I think we're probably headed there. If we were to reconvene in 20 years, we would probably have hit that point. And speaking of periods of stability and change, Canada's Indigenous relationship with the municipalities, I think, is something important here as well. So Alex does a great job in detailing the municipal Indigenous relationship, which I think a lot of people don't immediately consider when we think about reconciliation. And Alex does a fantastic job of reminding us that the reconciliation project is also a local one. In fact, just from some of the work that I've done on service sharing, you can see that there's a lot of important servicing relationships happening between Indigenous band governments and municipal governments across the country. In fact, as you go to some areas, you see that the band government has tremendous capacity and a lot of goodwill and is doing a lot of fantastic work for municipalities to support them where they don't have the capacity themselves. And a lot of these relationships are also very actor-centered, right? I think you've probably countered this too, where an election of a new mayor or councillor or something can reset the relationship, and sometimes in a very positive way, sometimes a very negative way as well. So what I think this shows us too is that that reconciliation is very actor-centered, and I think as the whole entire project progresses, we need to be mindful of how the pieces connect, and I think Alex's work does a fantastic job of that. We're currently in a provincial election for some reason, and we're gonna get to a federal election soon enough. One of the things that I was thinking about as I was reading Alex's paper is that that reconciliation hasn't been front and center in either of those conversations. So Alex really points to a lot of positive momentum here, and I think to maintain that, we have to ensure that reconciliation fits into those conversations in some way, shape, or form. So. It also highlights the importance of Alex's work as an ongoing project too. So thank you for that. And I'll close with Zack's article, because I think it is a real call to action in a way for a lot of us who study local governments. I think Zack effectively makes the case that there's a lot that the academic community can do, and that we can do to shape municipal government over the next 20 years, which is fantastic. And this kind of got me thinking back to my time here as a postdoctoral fellow back in 2013, very long time ago. And really at that time, there were certainly folks who were writing about municipal government, but there wasn't a lot of scholarly infrastructure around municipal government research, and IMFG was kind of the show back then, right? And I think that just reflecting back, we can see that there's been a lot more of that scholarly infrastructure placed around the research, and I think with these three, we can definitely see it here. Gabe with the Urban Policy Lab, and Alex with the Housing Research Collaborative, Zack with the Center for Urban Policy and Local Governance, and the Local Democracy Project. Outside of this room, we see Jack Lucas with the Canadian Municipal Barometer, Mike McGregor with the Canadian Municipal Election Study, U of T. Of course, we have the School of Cities. There's a lot happening here that was once kind of a dream, right? And a lot of that kind of spread from what Enid started here, which I think is fantastic. And I think just reading Zack's piece, it kind of reminds us that we're not just kind of observers and commenters on the game. We are actors and players in our own right, which I think is important for us to remember. And he also highlights a number of ways in which we can build tools to gather more data and more insight on municipal government finance, not just for the IMFG, but for all of us as well. It's a great reminder for me too that I think we have an obligation to engage with municipalities directly, and if we want to help shape the next 20 years, there's more of a sort of practitioner role for academics as well to really get engaged and support them where we can, not just through research, but also directly with policy work. And that also gives me a good opportunity to say some nice things about Enid, which is always helpful at events like this. I think Enid's a great example of this, of someone who has spent a lot of time not just studying municipalities, but also getting involved in a practical sense, supporting them with either it's consulting or policy work, but also working with the media as well to sort of let Canadians understand some of the intricacies about their municipal governments. As Gabe points out in his piece, Enid was an original member of that Who Does What panel, and I think still has some of the scars to prove it. But another great example of how she's always been on call to support municipalities throughout her career. So I'll say, I think that Enid is a great lead for us to follow, that when we have the knowledge and insight, share it, put it into the hands of the right people, work with practitioners, and when we can make positive change, do it. And with that, I will wrap up and just thank the three authors for presenting us with some challenges over the next 20 years, but also a number of different opportunities for all of us to get involved and to make some positive change. So thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Okay, so we're going to move into the Q&A portion. I'll kick us off, but hopefully we'll have time for one or two audience questions as well. And keep in mind that in addition to a question, if you want to also share a little bit about your vision for local governance in the next 20 years, please feel free to do so. So think about that as we're discussing up here. So Zack, I loved your point around punctuated equilibrium. And so maybe I'll sort of start with that. For the panel. You know, the changes that all of you are talking about, whether it's greater Indigenous sovereignty or clear intergovernmental relationships or expanded municipal authority or filling the local governance, knowledge, and data gap, none of these conversations are new. They're long-standing. The organizer Marshall Gans was here in the fall, and he said something similar to Alan around change. You know, change is really slow until it's really fast. And maybe we're in a really fast moment right now. So in this moment that we're in, I'd love to hear from any of the panelists around what's giving you hope. Are you hopeful that these long-standing conversations, change is around the corner? And if not, what's making you pessimistic about the likelihood of some of these big changes moving in the right direction?
You're the most hopeful. You start.
Yeah. I do lean towards optimism as a human, so that's true. You know, I guess it depends on what aspect of change we're talking about. I think there's a big cry for leadership. We're screaming for leadership. And in that universe of different governments, whether it's municipal, we have to mention regional as well, provincial, federal, there is and has been room for strong cities to come out and offer excellent solutions on how we can address significant changes. So for example, since we're here in Toronto, thinking about Mayor Chow's recent move to pull together what Zack has written a lot about, intergovernmental coordination. We don't have anything that's robust at the national scale, and it's being piloted here in Toronto. That's a really positive move. It's something we need desperately. It's sort of number one on my list for the next 20 years as well. So that's promising that local actors can play such a significant role and have played a significant role in the past as well. There's areas where I'm not hopeful. You know, that Spider-Man meme of, you know, all of the governments pointing at each other. That's also the era that we're in. That's the counterbalance to strong leadership is, you know, it's not my problem. And in our fractured constitutional framework where we say creatures of the province, but that's not exactly accurate. There's elements that are left out of the Constitution in terms of who actually should be doing what. Childcare isn't in there, housing isn't in there, healthcare isn't in there. There's a lot of silences around who's responsible and a lot of backing away. And that's probably the thing that I'm the most fearful of in that landscape of we have needs, they have to be addressed, and we don't have governments walking up to the table and saying that they're willing to do the right thing, what that means, acting in a way that's oriented to the problem at hand and thinking about the people who are most desperately in need. So that worries me, and it worries me where we have generative AI and we have climate change and we have big things looming. I am hopeful about Indigenous municipal relationships, though. That is a place where I think, probably because of the legal landscape, there's a forced reckoning in your equilibrium. There's a forced momentum. I don't think it's on the agenda in the same way that it was in past elections, because it doesn't need to be. We've had judicial decisions. We've had other momentum that has occurred. I think we know now there's a fourth level of government, even though it's not one of the three that you talked about. There's a fourth level of government that's part of a lot of these conversations. It's just not as front and center. So yeah, it's kind of a baby bear, mama bear, papa bear kind of situation. I think there's reasons to be hopeful in terms of the next steps.
Anyone else want to jump in?
I mean, I think we are at potentially a fork in the road, right? With the way that we think about how intergovernmental relations, multi-level governance works. We are in a moment particularly in Toronto and Ontario, right, where there is a lot of frustration with maybe the province sticking its nose in things that really the province shouldn't be sticking its nose in, right? And that is not happening everywhere in the country. It's happening most profoundly here.
and Alberta.
And Alberta, but you know, we pay attention to what's in front of our noses. So, so what I worry about is that there's a reflexive reaction to arbitrary events of the moment to seek to disengage local governments from federalism. And I think that would be a long-term mistake. I think what that does, if we move in a direction where local governments say, okay, we get to eat what we kill, winner takes all, that means that successful places do well and less successful places suffer, right? It undermines a logic of interregional equity in our country and in our province. And it would give higher level governments an excuse to just let us rise and fall on our own, community by community. So I think this is not necessarily a constitutional or institutional issue. It is a political issue. And the politics have to be about figuring out a way to bend higher level governments toward the constructive support of local initiative. And through that pooling of resources and constructive support, which has existed at other times in Canadian history, in different provinces and different metropolitan areas, we have done well by that, right? And I think that should be the political project that we bend ourselves towards in the next 20 years.
Anything to add? Okay.
I want to hear from the group.
All right. Well, then let's do that. We have some mics that we're going to pass around. If anyone has a question, please raise your hand. You can introduce yourself, ask a question, and again, if you'd like to make any commentary about the future of local governance in the next few decades from your perspective, please do. Anyone want to jump in? We've got someone in the back there and then someone in the front after.
Thanks, everybody. I'm Martin Horak from Western University, and it's great to be here with everybody. I think I want to make a comment first and then have a question, but the comment really echoes some of what's already coming out as a theme at the table. And in some of my recent writing and thinking about multi-level governance, I've also really come to the conclusion that one of the biggest challenges in Canada right now, and one of the main things that those of us who think and research about intergovernmental relations should be thinking about, is how can we kind of strengthen that connective tissue among different scales of government or levels of government? Because in many ways, we're structurally disadvantaged in Canada in comparison with other federations. If you look at other federal systems, there's often the same parties at different levels of government, which strengthens the political connection. And in civil law systems, there's the same basic administration that stretches across scales of governance. We don't have either of those things, right? And so, as Zack said, it's really kind of a matter of politics, political will, right? But it doesn't have to be just that. If we start thinking about how can we conceptualize kind of an institutionalization of those connections. So it's not just like, you know, somebody has coffee with somebody else or the free-for-all brawl, whoever said that. And I think this is a really serious kind of research agenda and thinking agenda for all of us who care about cities, because local governments can't do it on their own and left to their own devices. It's like Zack said, it's the United States where, you know, winners take all, right? So that's kind of the agenda piece. And I guess I had a question for Alex. I've been engaging with a doctoral student who's First Nations student who's working on municipal Indigenous relationships, and we've been talking about the ways in which the opportunities to grow those relationships might be different from province to province, specifically in BC. You see BC municipalities really being leaders in this. We've been reflecting on why, and we've been thinking about, is that because really in BC, those relationships were never historically settled in the first place in the way they were in many other provinces where treaty relationships could lead the, you know, settler colonial state to say, it's done and it's taken care of, right? And so we'll be interested to hear whether you have reflections on different kind of opportunities and trajectories from one part of the country to another.
Yeah, thank you so much for the question, Martin. I do think the fact that BC has many fewer, there still are treaties in BC, but there's fewer of them, has certainly made a difference in terms of the role of the courts in rejecting the Canadian model for what power those First Nations would have. So it's meant that, you know, for example, the different nations are actually able to get land back, have Aboriginal title over their lands, which in turn has led to economic development, you know, even housing authorities being created by different First Nations. So it's a ripple effect. Out east and in central Canada, it's a whole different story depending on the region in question. But even treaties now are being seen very differently. I'm sure you and your student would know this, that even if there was a treaty, there's a increasing recognition by the courts that doesn't actually define the relationship, that those treaties were signed in a certain way at a certain time, and that doesn't mean that the land was given over and there's no role for the First Nation anymore. So the way I see it, it's kind of temporal. I think BC is leading the charge because there weren't as many treaties, almost no treaties, in the first place. But I don't think that means that other First Nations are not going to see the same kinds of developments. It's just gonna be at a different pace.
We had a question in the front here. Yeah. Just wait for the mic. We have some people listening online. Thanks.
So there's a lot of talk here about intergovernmental relations, which I think is just a great big swampland and will always be, because it's a terrific way for somebody to say, I'm only partly responsible and you got to do your thing. And what I'd like to hear more talk about is what municipalities should be doing on their own without the other levels of government interfering with them and making sure they've got the money to do it. Because I think that's the only way we're going to start to address municipal problems. I mean, you look at Scandinavia, that's what they've got, right? They've got governments that actually have their own responsibilities to do things and the money to actually do it with. And we don't have that. And just more intergovernmental relationship, it's just going to be more swampland forever and ever. So could we get you to address the question, what should municipalities be doing and have the funding to do it? Transit as an example, housing as an example, social welfare as an example. I'd like to hear about that.
Who does what question? Should I take that one?
Okay, Gabe.
So I'm just going to try to reflect the positions of the authors collectively. And what I got my sense from both speaking and reading the author's work is that that list is very, very short. So think about, just go through the topics, right? Housing, transportation you mentioned, etc. Very few of those in current context are specifically local and municipal in nature. Housing is a regional housing market. Greg Sutter mentioned that in his piece. Transportation is naturally at a regional scale, etc. There were very few topic areas that we covered in that series that I think the majority of our authors would say that is a local issue that can be addressed strictly by municipalities, and that's why I ended off by saying one of the themes that I picked up from everyone's work was the importance of building up, I don't think they use the word swampland, but building up these intergovernmental, the capacity for municipalities to engage meaningfully. So it's a two-way street, right? And I've written on this in the past. Think about it, and I know we have some CAOs in the room and some former CAOs in the room. Think about how many municipal staff are dedicated to working in intergovernmental affairs relative to how many would be employed in that area at the federal or provincial level, right? There isn't a lot of resources and capacity that's put into that at the local level, in some cases for good reason, because we're dealing with very small municipalities with small budgets, but for the larger municipalities, I think historically we can say that they've underinvested in those areas. And so if I triangulate, put those two together where our expert authors and the who does what contributors are saying we need more of this coordination because the nature of the problems that we're trying to solve go beyond, in most cases, municipal boundaries, then you need to match that at the municipal level to be able to provide those resources at the local level, and you need external forums to be able to have a productive dialogue between governments. So once you build up the capacity at the local level, make it more than just a bear pit where people are screaming at people on the stage. Obviously, there's more to that than that. There's lots of, behind closed doors conversations that happen between staff and on the political side as well. But that is, I think, in many cases, a fair representation of the role of municipalities. Think about, we talked about the City of Toronto Act. Noticed recently that the City of Toronto purchased a new membership card to the AMO, right? Which part of the conversation in those days was we don't need that. And that's a recognition that fundamentally in our system, despite all of the nuances of creatures of province in our constitutional system, et cetera, fundamentally municipalities are still operating as interest groups within our intergovernmental system. That's what AMO is. And so if that's the case, then you need to build up your lobbying and other types of capacity to engage in that type of relationship, or you redefine the relationship and you build forums to actually recognize those local governments as partners, as actual government partners, and include, of course, First Nations in that conversation as well. And I think there's a lot of similarities there, obviously many differences, but a lot of similarities in terms of how you get a seat at that table, so to speak.
I think we've spent a lot of time in the last few decades, especially in Ontario, trying to imagine how there could be watertight compartments of jurisdiction across different levels of government, where there is exclusive jurisdiction and the financing of the delivery of that exclusive jurisdiction. We have devoted all kinds of energy to the idea of disentangling. I think that in our complex world that we have today is a red herring. I think that different levels of government have different levels of expertise. They have different resources. They have different capacities. And the only way we can solve problems that operate at diverse scales, from the global to the regional, metropolitan regional, but also broader hinterlands of metropolitan areas, rural areas, and so on, is through the pooling of resources across levels of government. It is messy. It is political. It is not clean. It is not tidy. But I don't see another way to do it. Canada is not Sweden, and it never will be. Sweden emerged, the Swedish welfare state emerged out of a very idiosyncratic historical process spanning 200 years, and the integration of municipalities into that welfare state and the way that the cross-partisan interaction works is not something where we can flip a switch and become Sweden. It's just not going to happen. So I worry about this kind of pointing to other places and sort of cherry picking, well, Sweden, or Germany or whatever. I don't think that helps us because they have their own problems. So I think we need to embrace the messiness and make it work politically and make that the political project of our time.
Embracing the messiness. I love that.
Respond very briefly.
We only
John,
have a
we can
couple
talk
minutes.
over the canapes. Yep.
We got reception time. That's
We
good.
do have a reception, so we can move the debate into the reception room soon. We only have, very few more minutes, and I'm going to take the moderator's privilege with the last question, which is, we've talked a lot about the classroom, and so I'd love to end there about the future of municipal leadership. You are all also teachers in your own right, and so you have a unique perspective on the next generation of bureaucrats and policy advocates and thinkers about cities and governance. So I wonder if anyone wants to close us off by talking about your students and what that tells you about the next generation of municipal leaders.
I see a few in the audience. I'll get started there, and you're all in the same row. No, there's others as well. I see Lauren and Zack and Tashi. Is that Tashi too? A current student, which is fantastic, involved. So yeah, you were asking about optimism and hope before. Absolutely in my students, and I'm sure you all agree as well. I see that optimism and hope, and connecting the students that have been through IMFG with current students as well. Like I love, for example, that Tashi's sitting beside Zack. Do you guys know each other? You should say hello right now. Because it's like current and past, it's fantastic. It's a former graduate fellow. So yes, no, there's a lot going on there, and I think what I have seen in the classroom is to frame the conversation around cities rather than just municipalities, because one thing that I would point out, and what IMFG's work has really gone beyond just the title of municipal finance and governance, is to look at larger cities and urban policy in general, because we have people that have been involved both at IMFG but also in my classroom and your classrooms as well, that have gone to other levels of government, worked in civil society organizations, industry, etc., that have brought that perspective to their work. And I think that's been really fantastic, a contribution from IMFG, and I see nodding heads there, because the colleagues, the peers of these students that are in the room that would, maybe this group working in municipal governments, right, would know that the broader cohort of students that have read IMFG's papers in my classes and all of our classes, etc., but have also been involved and participated in IMFG for a long time, have spread their wings in many different places beyond just the municipal sector, and I think that's a fantastic thing, and something that brings me a lot of hope and optimism.
Do we have any graduates in the room of Western's local government program? Well, we have a half hand. Hey, is that Owen? Yeah, hi, Owen. Martin Horak, who's here, and I teach in Western's local government program, which celebrated its 50th anniversary this year, and we're very proud of it. It's trained well over 1,000 through its MPA program and various diploma programs over 50 years, and placed graduates really across the municipal sector, all across Canada, but especially around here and in Southern Ontario. Most of our students are mid-career professionals, people who are specialists, who are trying to become generalists, who are trying to move into a higher level of management and move on from being a librarian or a fire chief or a clerk or something, and become a generalist. And watching that process happen has been the most inspiring pedagogical experience of my career, having taught lots of different kinds of students, and they do make me optimistic. We're also teaching students who are not by and large, from big cities. We're talking about places that have the biggest capacity gaps, the places that are the least professionalized, smaller places, places that are under 50,000 people, even under 20,000 people, under 10,000 people, where they're facing all kinds of problems: homelessness, opioid addiction, transportation problems, collapsing infrastructure, you name it, and approaching it with heroic intention and feeling the need to meet these challenges, but often not being entirely sure how, right? So being exposed to a non-big city perspective has actually been very rewarding to me, because that's where millions of people live across this country in smaller places than Toronto.
Well, on that note of future-focused happiness, we are out of time. So please join me in thanking the panelists and discussants today. So we're going to pass it over to the next panel on finance. We're going to do a little bit of a song and dance with the mic switches. While we're doing that, if you want to stand up and stretch, please feel free to do so. We'll be back in 1 minute.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming back. Hi, Ellen. Thanks for coming back for panel number 2. So my name is Andre Cote. I'm one of the former managers who's been referenced. Honored to be here for this event. Honored to have the opportunity to moderate this panel with a bunch of illustrious IMFGers. So I'll start and very quickly just sort of talk about my IMFG story, because this event also had me reflecting a little bit on my time here. So when I came to U of T to do a master's degree in public policy, and at that point I knew about this much about city policy, urban affairs. So I really had my kind of urban awakening here. And there were really 2 aspects. One of them was I had an amazing internship at the city, in the city manager's office, with some fantastic mentors, one of whom's in the room, Tobias at the back. Totally opened my eyes to city government, and I also had a really interesting project while I was there. And so when I came back, I was looking for opportunities to sort of dig into it on campus here. I shifted all of my sort of coursework into urban in my second year of the program, and I stumbled upon Enid and IMFG. I had the good fortune of winning a fellowship, the Allen Broadbent Fellowship. Sorry, Alan, your name has had to be associated with me over all these years. But it was an amazing experience, and I at the time the topic was it was 10 years on from the amalgamation, which I know had been an amalgamation that maybe many had not asked for, and so the research was to sort of look at 10 years on, where are we, and have there been positive outcomes? Is it a maturing metropolis was the question, and so I've been thinking a little bit more about that. 10, 15 more years on, what would I say? It was also a fascinating time in the urban space in Toronto, and so I wrapped up here. I went to work in government for a few years and enjoyed it so much that I came back as manager a few years later. So from around 2011 to 14, and that time was we might remember there was some mayoral hijinks maybe during that period. It was like truly sort of a crazy and surreal time when you look back. I remember this sort of terrifying interview invited into the studio at CTV to talk about municipal governance. And you get questions like, what are the municipal governance implications of a mayor caught smoking crack? And you'd say, I have no idea. So anyways, not to poke fun at our past mayor. Obviously, he had his troubles, but it was a fascinating time. And we did some great work here. I won't say too much more about it. I know Enid referenced one of our papers about the fiscal health of the city ahead of the 2014 election, where we tried to get a little bit of profile around fiscal health issues during a campaign where often the evidence is not what people are often looking for. So just some recollections there. So very indebted to you, Enid, and Alan, to many of the folks in this room for an amazing experience here at IMFG, and happy to be part of the alumni, part of the, still have my hotel chit or whatever it may be. And so let's turn to the panel. So what we will do is first have another video introduction from a former mayor, from David Miller, who was around just before that period. And then I'll invite up the panelists, Enid, who needs no introduction, Adam Found, who is the manager of corporate assets in the finance department at the City of Kawartha Lakes, and another esteemed IMFG fellow, and Maddie Simyaticki, who is professor of geography and planning, director of U of T's Infrastructure Institute, and a longtime IMFG collaborator. with Almos Chastney as our discussant for the panel. So with that, we'll cue up the video. Thanks.
Congratulations to the Institute on Municipal Governance and Finance on its 20th anniversary. For over 20 years, this institute has contributed tremendously to progressive thinking about municipal governance and finance, not just in Toronto, but across Ontario and Canada. I particularly want to highlight the work done in its early days to support the efforts of Canadian cities to secure a New Deal for cities with the Paul Martin government, an idea that might seem routine now, but at the time was considered to be radical. And the financing that flowed from that New Deal, negotiated with mayors and city councils across Canada and the Paul Martin government with John Godfrey, the Minister of Cities and Communities, still flows to this day. The Institute was also involved in its work, very supportive of the City of Toronto Act, negotiated between the City of Toronto and the Province of Ontario, which gave new funding sources to the City of Toronto, including the power to levy a land transfer tax, which has been so successful that it supports the city finances still today in 2025. For that and much more, I want to give thanks to the Institute and wish it much success for the next 20 years. Its work will matter because cities matter. Why do cities matter? Well, for at least 3 reasons. First of all, they're the home to superb innovation, and that innovation is global. For the past few years, I've had the privilege of working with C40 Cities, a coalition of mayors of the world's largest cities who've come together to use their voices and their actions to help the world avoid climate breakdown. And I've seen firsthand the incredible innovation that's happening globally. And if you want to know more about that, our podcast, Cities 1.5, has all sorts of stories of innovative city leadership happening globally. Secondly, in the Canadian context, cities are the home of our economy. They're the home of our people. They're the place that settles newcomers. They're often the home of vibrant arts and cultures. They're really important to the success of Canada as a whole. In Toronto's case, within a 1-hour drive of Toronto City Hall, we have about 20% of the Canadian economy, a real reason to ensure that cities succeed. And the third reason is perhaps a subtle one, but city government by its nature is incredibly democratic. It's not a form of government dominated in most parts of Canada by party politics. And it, by its nature, invites residents into the ongoing conversation about how to shape the future of their city. So cities matter. They're the home of innovation. They're the home of the economy. They're the home of people. And they're home of real democracy. And the question for me is, how do we ensure their long-run success? And the fact of the matter is that how we finance cities matters to that success. In the Canadian context, about 93 or 94% of all of the tax revenue paid by individuals and businesses goes to Ottawa and the provincial governments. Very little remains in the cities where it's raised. And this creates a huge challenge. If Torontonians, for example, want to build a 21st century city complete with a 21st century transportation network with affordable housing, ensuring that no one is left behind. For big projects, in order to complete that vision, they need the support of Ottawa and Queen's Park. And not only is that somewhat non-democratic, it's also not functional to have to align 3 orders of government at the same moment in order to build the city for the future. To correct this, the finance needs to change. And I often like to think about what Toronto would look like if the city government collected all the taxes and Ottawa and Queen's Park had to come for grants instead of the other way around. Would the people's desire for a rapid transit network reaching all parts of Toronto, including lower income neighborhoods, be met? Would the city have found a way to build new affordable housing on public land without having to go to Ottawa and Queen's Park and beg for funding? And would we have been able to ensure that those who have the least can live safely and healthily in our city? I'd venture a yes. And when thought about in that way, the answers to the challenges that cities face seems obvious. Ensure that more of the tax money that's raised in those cities stays there to help build the city of the future. When I was in office, we campaigned for a share of the GST. We weren't successful. But sharing sales and income taxes at their heart will be essential if our cities are to thrive the way they should. And that's not just a city imperative. It's not just an imperative for the people of Toronto. It's an economic imperative. Because if the home to 20% of the Canadian economy is going to succeed, we need to invest. Today, it often makes no sense for the city to invest in certain projects from a traditional business perspective. People often say the government should be run like a business. I don't agree. I think government should be run properly like a government, providing excellent public services. But a business that didn't get revenue back from its investments would never invest. And that's the case for city governments. For example, when the National Trade Center at Exhibition Place was built, the federal share was paid off in 6 or 7 years, the provincial in 7 or 8, and the city government, its share was never paid back because it doesn't share in the revenues from sales and income taxes that were created by the Trade Center. That's just one example. But if we want our cities to succeed, we do have to fix the finance and ensure that revenues that grow with economic growth remain in the city government's hands. And for me, this isn't just a financial or economic principle, and it isn't just about social justice and inclusion, although it's all of that. It's also about about a democratic issue, which is at the heart of city governments. Why should somebody who lives in a small town in Northern Ontario have the same say through their vote over where the city of Toronto should build a new light rail or a new subway or even a new convention center as somebody who lives in the city of Toronto? It makes no sense to have to go to other orders of government in order to ensure that the city can meet the needs and aspirations of Torontonians or Hamiltonians or Ottawans for that matter. It's long past the time when we should solve these problems in Canada, and we won't be able to do it democratically or as elected officials without a strong, thoughtful academic case. And that case is to be made by the Institute. I wish you extraordinary joy in your 20th anniversary celebrations and deliberations. I regret the fact that I'm not in Toronto today and unable to be with you, and look very much forward to a continued excellence in the work that's produced by this Institute, having important influence on our democratic debates about how we fund cities and how we govern them into the future. Thank you and good luck.
Okay, so a great kickoff for the panel. I'll welcome the panelists up. I love the thought experiment about what if Queen's Park was the creature of City Hall. So welcome Enid, Adam, Maddie. So our prep for this panel, a slightly different approach, I think, from the previous one. So all of the panelists had produced the papers that were posted and shared out, I guess, over the last couple weeks. And so I think our plan was we'd go each in turn, spend about 5 minutes just sort of talking through the highlights of the papers, and then we'll have a few questions and we'll open it up to you in the audience. So Enid, if you want to kick things off.
Thank you. Budget bailout needed once again. Toronto Star headline goes on to say Toronto's budget troubles are the result of the raw deal the city gets from the provincial and federal governments, and calls for a new deal so that Toronto will be able to stand on its own. Toronto Star when? December 8th, 2004. That's just around the time we founded IMFG, December 2004. So we have spent 20 years, probably longer, thinking about these issues. One of the things that we did at IMFG, and I talked about it before, was we tried to look at whether cities in Canada are fiscally sustainable. We did a conference, we had a book, but we also did some work in Toronto that Andre referred to. And Andre and I wrote a paper, I guess it was before an election, Is Toronto Fiscally Sustainable? And I learned a lot from the research we did on that paper. I learned that if you mention the Toronto Maple Leafs in an article, you'll get more press, more TV interviews than anything else you can write about. Because we concluded in the paper that the city, in answer to the question, is Toronto fiscally sustainable, it was yes and no. So we looked at all these measures, if property taxes, increased much in the last 10 years, and they were at or below the rate of inflation at that time. If expenditures per capita, when adjusted for inflation, have they gone out of control? No, they were pretty flat. What about municipal borrowing? Well below provincial limits, or in the case of City of Toronto limits on borrowing. So by all the fiscal measures, Toronto was looking pretty good. It was fiscally healthy. But we said the problem was the fiscal health was at the expense of the overall health of the city. In other words, infrastructure was deteriorating, the quality of services was declining. So, I was taught actually by Richard Byrd never to say who wrote what in an article, but Andre decided to say, well, it's like an aging Maple Leafs defenseman. He's playing okay, the coaches are looking after him, but he's getting kind of costly and he may need knee surgery very soon. That hit all the papers. And I have to tell you, because I think he'd be really upset if I didn't, he's a Senators fan.
It's true. Yeah. But I knew my audience, right?
So we said this 10 years ago, that Toronto was fiscally healthy because it has to be, right? You have to balance your budget, you have to do all these things, but it's at the expense of infrastructure and services. And things have gotten much more difficult since then. And in the essay that I wrote, I talk about some of the challenges that cities are facing today that they weren't even facing 10 years ago. Some of them are the same. The infrastructure deficit is still a problem. And in fact, we see municipalities increasing or finding the need to increase their state of good repair budget, the amount of money they need to spend to keep their infrastructure in a state of good repair. That is not going down. And in fact, we've seen water main breaks in Calgary and Montreal, and we're going to see more of that, I predict. Affordable housing is a huge issue today that municipalities are involved in. Cybersecurity. The threat of a cyber attack and what that costs a municipality, either if they do face an attack or if they're trying to prevent one. There's cost to that. Immigration. We've seen immigration targets increase, and immigration settlement is something cities do. So at least in the short run, when people come to our cities, there's municipal expenditures. Climate change. We talked already about extreme weather events, floods and hurricanes and forest fires. And that means municipalities have to spend money on cleanup. They also have to reduce GHG emissions. If we're going to meet our climate goals, cities have to retrofit buildings, electrify transit, do a lot of things that we didn't talk about 20 years ago. We knew about it, but they were not in the forefront. There's the opioid crisis, and the list goes on. These are challenges, some of which we faced for a long time. They're getting worse, others that are fairly new. So what do we need to do? And we've talked a lot here today about figuring out who does what. What should municipalities be doing? Should they be in the business of delivering social services, public health, ambulance services? Or is that a role for the provincial or federal governments? And I don't want to get too engaged in this intergovernmental piece that we're having a little discussion about. But when I was on the Who Does What panel in 1996, we were very keen on separating responsibilities. We were supposed to look at what should go up to the province, what should go down to municipalities. There was that separation. But we've learned since then that that's really not doable. You can't take it all up to the province or down to the municipalities. There does have to be some working together. Because services spill over municipal boundaries, people are affected by it. And so I think the thinking on that has changed to some extent. So we need to figure out who does what, and then how to pay for it. And so if municipalities are going to deliver social services, the property tax is not the best way to do that. Now, I'm probably one of the only people in this room who doesn't think the property tax is regressive. But I would at least agree it's not as progressive as an income tax. So if we're going to talk about social services at the municipal level, then we have to match up the right revenues to pay for it. We can't expect that to be on the property tax. So what have we seen happen? We've seen some movement over the years, over the 20 years. We have seen the City of Toronto Act that we've talked about. David Miller talked about in his presentation. We have seen, gas tax funding, which was really never about the gas tax, but the Canada Community Building Fund. We have seen some things happen. We have seen some who does what exercises, not just in Ontario, but around the country. We have seen some changes over time, but we haven't seen a fundamental change in the system of municipal finance. And as I often say, that goes back to 1849, to the Baldwin Act in Ontario, when cities were doing, roads, water, that was about it, and they had property taxes, user fees, and transfers. And when you think of the range of services and the challenges cities are facing today, and they still largely have property taxes, a few smaller taxes, user fees, and transit. So the fundamental system, which dates back to 1849, in my view, isn't working today. We have made some changes to get to a better system, but I still think we have a long way to go. People ask me, do I think it will happen in my lifetime? Well, not in mine, but maybe in the lifetime of some of my students. Are we at a crisis point where we really are going to have to make a change, or are we still going to muddle along? And that's what we've been doing for 20 years, maybe longer, muddling along. I always like to end on a positive note. I'm a bit like Alex there. I like to be optimistic. I think the other governments are starting to get it, starting to understand that we have to figure out what municipalities should be doing and what sources of revenue they should have. So I'm hoping we'll move more in that direction.
Okay, ending on a hopeful note. Adam, over to you. Your focus was on development charges.
Yes,
you don't have to focus purely there, but
I was hoping you would say that because there's a lot of interesting discussion going on here, and I certainly want to try to pick up on some of the threads that have been exposed. So I first want to mention that I came here today actually very much conflicted in my mind because I wasn't sure, am I coming here as a practitioner, as an academic, or as an advocate for municipalities, because I do have all three roles currently in my portfolio, and I think I finally resolved that the answer is all of the above. So I think my comments are going to be colored with that background. I did want to also first want to mention that I am very honored to be here, to be a part of this occasion, because it is quite a milestone, as we've heard from Mayor Miller and President Gertler, and so it is an honor to be a part of that story. My story at IMFG goes all the way back to 2009, when I was a recipient of what was then known as, I believe, the Allen Broadbent Fellowship in Graduate Studies. And at that time, I was very busily trying to recruit Enid to be my dissertation supervisor, which thankfully worked out, and again makes me feel very privileged to continue the tradition, because we heard that Richard Bird was your supervisor, and then in turn you were mine, and so it's nice to see that continuity. I guess I will talk a little bit about development charges since I did write an essay on it. And I've been blessed with the opportunity to write not one, but two IMFG papers on this topic.
You didn't get it right the first time.
Yeah, that's right. I did. That's right. I obviously didn't do a very good job the first time around, so I had to do it again. No, but I did try my very best to come at the issue from two angles, and so I will speak to those angles a little bit today. So I think one thing we need to recognize is that development charges are playing an increasingly important role in municipal finance as time goes on. And I know when we look at particularly the media coverage of this issue, I think we're seeing a lot of questions as to why are development charges rates going up so rapidly. And I'd like to offer, I would say, a hypothesis as to why that is occurring, and I think this is an area for future research. If you go back to the 1960s and 70s and 80s, and maybe even to the 90s, one thing you'll notice is that growth-related infrastructure at the municipal level was largely funded by the provincial government and the federal government. And so what that arrangement did was really alleviate municipalities from that responsibility, for better or worse. And we could have that debate about whether that was good or bad. I'm just here to talk about what I think the impact is now that we've moved away from that. And I think starting in about the mid-1990s, we started to see those grants sort of go away. And naturally, we started to see development charges come more to the forefront. And at this particular time, I think what we're seeing is that much of that infrastructure that was put in place with a vast amount of excess capacity is now getting to a state where that capacity has been used up. And so now municipalities are at the next stage of expansion. And when they look around, they see not very much in the way of grants, and so they're having to rely on development charges. And I think that largely explains, what is going on out there. Again, that's my conjecture. I would like to see some research on that to see to what extent that is going on. Oh, so I did want to take a moment to step back a little bit and look at the broader context in which development charges operate. And we keep hearing the same question come up here, I think probably at least 5, 6, 7 times now, and that is, what should municipalities be doing? And in terms of that question, I think I'm going to find myself somewhere between Zack Taylor and Mayor Sewell. So I think they both had very good points to raise on this front. It's true that we live in a messy federalist system. Absolutely, we do. But I also am sympathetic to Mayor Sewell's question, which is, can we at least make it cleaner? Is there a way to, maybe not make it perfect, but at least make it better and have clearer lines of responsibility as to who does what? Because answering that question necessarily means answering the other question that keeps coming up here, which is, who should pay for what? And that very much relates to the issue of development charges, property taxes, and other things, as well as all the issues that you heard raised by Mayor Miller. So I think all these things are certainly connected and related, and that fundamental question needs to be answered first in order to answer the other questions that naturally flow from it. So I think that's sort of where I stand on the broader themes that are coming up here and how development charges fit into them. Now, I do want to end in a way that's very similar to Enid. Like Enid, I guess maybe I'm a good student after all. I learned to end on a point of optimism, and I certainly do share some of the optimism that has already been expressed here today. So I think I'll just do my best to try to add to that. One of the potentially positive consequences of grant money being, let's say, less available for growth-related infrastructure or just infrastructure in general, is that it really forces municipalities to become more self-reliant. And anyone who's known me long enough, I think, will know that that has been a principle of mine for a very long time. I very much support the idea that municipalities can be more self-reliant and that they should be more self-reliant. That doesn't mean they should have nothing to do with the other levels of government. I'm not saying that at all, but I am saying that I do believe there is room for them to become more self-reliant and that they should. One of the other, I guess the last thing I would want to mention about municipalities is that in this journey towards self-reliance, one thing I think I've noticed about municipalities is that they always find a way. They always find a way to make it work somehow. They might do it begrudgingly, they might do it screaming and kicking, they might do it in ways that we can't really imagine or necessarily agree with, but they find a way. And I think I have reason to believe that over the next 20 years, as the Institute of Municipal Finance and Governance starts to look at its next stage of life, that that it will be there at the forefront as our municipalities do find that way. And I look forward to seeing that occur.
Okay, excellent. Thank you, Adam. My wife is a property developer, so I'll take home for you your key messages on why the DC is elevated. I'm sure she'll be sympathetic. I'm just joking, obviously. Maddie, over to you, and maybe a nice segue around infrastructure issues.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I want to know which Maple Leafs defenseman you had in mind. Which aging defenseman? Were we talking Thomas Caberlet, Larry Murphy? How far down the list do we need to go?
That vintage, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So I want to just start out, like everyone else, by just saying a quick word about Enid and Alan and the Institute. I mean, it has been just such a joy and a pleasure to be working together all these years. I came to U of T in 2008. So we're getting on a little bit here. And I remember when I got here, I mean, I think of, my work is on infrastructure, transportation, housing, and those type of issues. And I'd always thought of those as planning issues. I teach urban planning, but very much as engineering, architecture, maybe business. And my connection with Enid and with Alan more broadly, to embrace the idea that this is also a finance issue. At its core, how you deliver infrastructure is a finance issue, and what gets built is a governance issue. And I think that Enid, the way that you and the Institute have taken this understanding and this idea of infrastructure writ large, this broad topic and theme, and made it very much about how we pay for it, who pays for it, who delivers it, under what delivery models. To take leadership in that space certainly shaped my thinking, and I think going out into the broader community here in Toronto and in Canada more broadly has been hugely impactful. This leads to the paper that I wrote, because I had been doing research myself on cost overruns and why projects seem to go vastly over budget over and over again. And while I was doing this work, you know, in our backyard on Front Street, there was a giant pit, and they couldn't figure out how to get Union Station finished. And they were just shoveling more money into this pit over and over again. And a little bit further north, up University and into York region, they were doing the exact same thing on the young York region Spadina subway extension. The same thing was happening. And we were having all of these debates over and over. Why does this keep happening? What's going on here? Why can't we get this right? Are we less competent than all our peers globally? What's happening? And Enid came to me and said, hey, I know you're doing a bit of research on this. Will you write a paper that kind of synthesizes the state of play, puts Toronto and Canada in its context, and tells us not just the what and the why or the how, but what we should do. Like, let's get some real solutions here. And so I set out and wrote a paper called Cost Overruns, Patterns, Causes, and Cures that really tried to address these issues. So to start, the patterns. we aren't alone, and that was somewhat both comforting and discomforting, that this is truly a global phenomena, that 9 out of 10 big infrastructure projects are going over budget, and the overruns are anywhere from something small, if you're lucky, to something catastrophic if you're unlucky and not good at your job. And this was happening here in Toronto, this was happening across Canada, this was happening globally. Then there was the why, and the why got into some interesting places. The why starts with technical problems that, of course, anyone who's done a renovation knows it's hard to, it's hard. This is hard work. There's some technical aspects about how you predict the future. What you might expect to be behind the walls isn't always there. In old cities, it's busy. You're moving utilities. So there was certainly technical aspects. But when you delved into this was something, the reason this kept happening was something so much more than just technical. You couldn't explain it that way, or we would have gotten better and we would have solved it. And it turned out in the research that there were two other things going on. One was issues around human psychology and optimism bias, that we are inherently an optimistic people, that we wouldn't get out of bed otherwise. The act of just living is an optimism. And we are baked into us this idea of being overly optimistic. And when that starts to get into organizations and institutions, bad things can happen. You start to overestimate your own ability to control the future, to understand, to plan for a future that is itself uncertain. Your organization becomes overconfident about their ability to control their subcontractors and to work with them. So this idea of optimism bias came up over and over, that there was this psychological issue. But there was also, if we're totally honest, something else going on here, which has much more to do with the potentials of deception and the way that what Ben Fluberg at Oxford University calls strategic misrepresentation. That actually there was something more about the desire to lowball prices, to get projects started, to get your project on the books rather than other projects that were competing with them, so that you would win and it was in a zero-sum game. And that's what was happening. And you saw this over and over, that politicians would step up to the microphones and say, we're going to build this project and it's going to cost X. And you'd look at the last 3 projects and say, well, all of those projects were way more than that. What are the chances that we've had deflation, not inflation? 0. That's not what's going to happen. And this happened over and over and over again. So the question, and I think to the Institute's real strength, this wasn't just about hectoring people or putting it on the record that we knew best. It was, okay, what are you actually going to do about this? And in the paper, I proposed a variety of solutions. One was just better data. I mean, we actually have so little information on what is happening with these projects and their comparative ability. And to the point about sports, I mean, this was in the beginning stages of the big data revolutions that were happening in sports. So like your favorite sports team is using reams of data to pick which player is going to play, how much they're going to pay them, what positioning, and all the rest. And when it came to infrastructure projects that were 10 and 50 and 100 times bigger than these sporting decisions, we were flying completely blind with no data and no information. So first off was, let's collect some better data. Then there was ideas around how we structure the projects. There were questions even at that point about public-private partnerships, which I was raising, and some other issues around training and capacity building. That maybe we should be training people. If these are such big and important decisions with huge financial ramifications, let's give people the capacity to actually deliver them. So that was the paper that got written. Enid organized an amazing panel in this exact room where we discussed these issues, and because of the power of this institute, the top people came. So I remember very distinctly, like Aaron Corey, who was the head of Infrastructure Ontario at the time, sat here and had a discussion. Someone from Ottawa, who was just setting out on the Ottawa LRT project, sat here and was part of that discussion. It was really meaningful for me as an academic to be able to share my ideas and have the people who were in the mix, doing the business, actually discuss them with me. Now, in some ways, the less optimistic part is what's come next. Because in reflecting on this paper now, over 10 years later, the answer is just about nothing. The reality is pretty much nothing has changed. We are making the exact same mistakes, change the names of the projects, change their location slightly, but essentially we are making the exact same mistakes. Eglinton Crosstown, Finch LRT, Huron-Ontario line. These projects are experiencing the exact same problems for the exact same reasons, and we've done very little learning. We don't collect better data from everything I can tell. We're using at that time at least, the procurement models hadn't changed all that much. We're not using external review boards. That's one of the solutions for optimism biases. You take an outside view. We're not doing that in any serious, meaningful, systematic way. And so we have the same problems over and over again. And so whereas many people have been optimistic here, my question for this room is, when are we going to do something different? Because one of the things I've noticed is there's this kind of like, I call it the mad as heck routine. Every time something goes wrong, and it really gets to the point where the public is angry about it, the politicians or the civic leaders step up to the microphone and talk about how angry they are about this. I mean, in the paper, I have a quote from Mayor Tory at that time, but you could quote anybody on this, even more recently about what's happened with the Eglinton Crosstown. This is an outrage. This should never happen. These people are incompetent. We will get to the bottom of this. And then nothing changes. And so I guess my cri de coeur, if you will, I love this city. And my question is, when are we going to do something different? When is like the mad as heck routine not going to be the end of the story, but the beginning? Because we actually know a lot of what needs to be done. We just need to do it. And I'm hopeful that an institute like this and the work that Enid does in amplifying and getting these papers in front of the right people, that we know what to do. We can do something different. And the question I'll leave you with is, when will we? Thank you.
Okay, amazing. Thank you, Maddie. So next we'll welcome Elmosh.
To answer the question.
To answer the question as the discussant. I like the sports analogy. I've been listening to the latest Michael Lewis podcast, which actually was about sports gambling. And so I was thinking, like, are we like Moneyball for infrastructure? Is that what we're... So anyways, welcome, Elmosh. Please, have at it.
Thank you very much for this very kind invitation. I was around before IMFG because I knew Enid in graduate school when I was doing a master's degree in economic history, and she was doing her PhD with Richard Byrd. And then we continued to cross paths because inadvertently I ended up working for the region of Durham. And then I was the elephant in the room in property tax policy. So it's an interesting concept to be a discussant of three very different papers, as well as thinking back to what Richard Byrd advised us to think about when we were thinking about municipal finance and governance issues. So I think, having said that, I have very mixed feelings about what I'm going to say. Because Richard always said, well, unsolved problems never die. And I think these three papers and the discussion basically show that in 20 plus years, we've been thinking about many of these issues and progress has been made. Significant, important contributions have been made to the scholarly literature and to thinking about these issues in a very consistent, coherent manner, in bringing out data sets and using them creatively across the whole, however many, I forget how many publications and conferences and discussions have happened. But as Richard pointed out to both of us, trial and error and empirical observation, learning is cumulative. So 20 years from now, I'm not sure, and this is a little bit what somebody asked me to go to an AMCT, the Association of Clerks and Treasurers Conference, and talk about the future. And looking around and saying, this thing in my pocket has more power than anything I ever saw 20 years ago. And we talk about, user fee policy, property tax collection, what is going to happen in terms of the world of technology. How are municipalities going to adapt to that? So I'm running away from my comments because really we talk about the appropriate role for local governments, the delivery of services. But then there's the question, how do you actually make people realize that they are actually getting a benefit from these municipal services? And the irony of the snowfall, this is taking up my 5 or 6 minutes, is when Nancy Bardetsky, who was the director of municipal finance branch at one time, she lived in North York, and I lived in the city of Toronto. This was after your time as mayor, Mr. Sewell, but anyway. And in the city of Toronto, there was no municipal shoveling of sidewalks. That was a North York Scarborough thing. Now, I have a sidewalk plow out there, the other day. My dog doesn't really like it because there's an awful lot of salt on the sidewalk, but that's just, my observation in terms of what's happened on municipal services. So it becomes very anecdotal here. The real problem in looking at these papers, though, is what comes across as what Richard reminded me as an economic historian, path dependency, and the institutional inertia. How do you get past that? Path dependency, well, Enid talks about the institutions set up by the Baldwin Act. Well, I've done some papers on that. My early reading was actually the infrastructure crisis of the 1340s, when the municipalities were complaining about an infrastructure problem, but it was to do with the Scots, the French, and building castles and fortifications around boundaries. So the real question is path dependency really a municipal fiscal crunch that's existed forever and a day, depending on who controlled the levers of power, who controls the tax mechanisms, and how do you define tax bases? How do you deal with changes and shocks? The other day, Peter Hall was in from Harvard, and he was giving a lecture on the current uncertainty setting of decision-making with economic ideas. But he was pointing out really that taxation systems have had to deal with a change from tangible to intangibles. And this is the salient question that we ended up with in the book that Richard, Enid, and I co-authored on the property tax system. And we are left with that question of, okay, you want to get access to the GST, you want to get access to income taxation. How do we then relate those tax systems to benefits received at a local level? How do you deal with the accountability structures? How are you going to deal with the collection structures? And so forth. But it is a very serious question, because right now the whole of the municipal finance world is tied into the taxation of tangibles, whether it's land, property, the land transfer tax, development charges. And so we're at that problem. Is there a tipping point? What is the effective tax rate on these tangibles that creates tax revolts? So you get to a certain point and then you have to move on. So that comes us back to, do cities have legislative capacity to deal creatively with their own areas of jurisdiction and resources? This is the subject of 2 books. Thank you, Madam Editors, on cities and constitutional space, and what can we do about that? And then the other question is it really up to other levels of government to cushion municipalities? This is, I forget the exact quote, you will remember, Wayne Thirsk was using it. It was about fiscal tubs standing on their own, whatever.
On fiscal bottoms.
On fiscal bottoms. And then all right, I'm indulging here for 30 seconds here, because Mayor Sewell asked this question, and I couldn't resist this, and Zack Spicer has left the room. The other day, the provincial government that I used to work for complained that municipalities were not funding hospital capital, okay? This is directly related to development charges. Immediately, because when I was working in 1980 at the region of Durham, we did not have a hospital lot levy. Peel Region did. And that was holdover from the old local community contribution that was supposed to be raised from charities and businesses and so forth. So when I have a provincial government that says, oh, you should be using lot levies to fund hospital capital, and then we have all this media about the level of these rates, it begs the question as to who's doing what very quickly. And then the next thing I see, a very lovely ribbon-cutting ceremony for the Markham campus of York University. And I'm saying to myself, well, here we go again, because the current provincial government was lauding and honoring York Region and Markham for supporting the spread of university capital facilities. So again, my question comes back to, is this the right place when, as has been mentioned in this room, transit, homelessness, municipal water and sewer capacity issues, and these other things, where there are clearly responsibilities within the intergovernmental framework that are not necessarily municipal. They're choices. They're made by council. For my sins, Enid referred the CBC Brampton reporter to me on this question. But these are choices made by councils, and so you're up against this. But it brings into question what is the intergovernmental framework on these fiscal questions. And lastly, I really did want to very quickly say that these three papers are very important because every single one of them is in the media eye, in the politician's eye, in the intergovernmental framework eye right now. The question of what tax bases will be open to municipalities, cities, large and small. The issue of development charges related to housing, pricing, financing, and so forth. And then Maddie's paper, which really brings to the fore the question of how do you measure the risks of large projects? Who carries the can and the freight for those the risk on those large projects? That's the underlying question. I didn't really refer to when I first hit P3s, it was like alphabet soup trying to teach it to students, whether it was build, operate, finance, build, operate, whatever. That's a whole other question. But so the optimism, well, we've soldiered along. We can make institutional changes. Some of them are small, some of them large, some of them happen in the 30 years I've been working on municipal finance issues. I won't go back to my undergraduate years. That's too far back. And it's before IMFG, but I am very grateful for this opportunity to speak very briefly. And IMFG has been a wonderful place to share thoughts and things. And also, I was very lucky because I broke every single provincial rule in getting involved in research projects. But they can't fire me that for now, so there it is. Thank you.
Yeah, Almosh, I remember you were doing research projects from within government, which is not something that would be entertained these days, or even
it's a little bit like Adam's.
I guess like Adam, yeah.
Am I a practitioner? Am I a practitioner of old? Yeah, I'm still kind of a practitioner. Yeah. On the other hand, I was straddling the academic stuff along the way, and that's for coffee hour, not now. Anyway.
Okay, so those are all great. We have almost 15 minutes, and so I have a list of fantastic questions, trust me, but rather than doing those, I'd prefer to just open it up, and so like the last one, questions, but also comments or maybe responses. Would anyone like to start? Yes, right over here.
I want to take issue a little bit with a very interesting discussion of infrastructure costs and the global nature of it. I don't think that's quite true. The New York Times has done some interesting articles comparing the cost of comparable projects in New York versus Paris. And there's dispute about what the bottom line is. Much, much cheaper in Paris to, for example, expand the subway system there. What are the features? One is market structure. New York is bedeviled by a monopoly market structure in expertise. There's a revolving door between the transit authority and the company that builds it. So you pad in enormous amounts of consulting. Unions, I'm very pro-union, but play in this case a somewhat nefarious role of feather bedding and increasing compared to France, which has very powerful unions. And maybe the most important thing is a political continuity in France, and maybe it's part of, it's because Paris is France. No matter what the regime, and there have been the continuing commitment to the project. And in New York, you see commitment goes up and goes down. other feature is that France has a social payment system, so a lot of the wage charges are paid by the federal government. So that should be factored in. But the bottom line remains that they have done better than us. And I've been following IMFG's papers in this to learn that Toronto seems to be subject to some of the same illness as New York. So it was easy for me to say, oh, New York. Well, maybe it's more universal than that. But I would like to see this engaged in in fact, I would like to do some research on that because I'm very involved in France and speak a good French. That would be a nice project to do. So thank you for your remarks, and those are just some reactions.
Yeah, no, those are great reactions. And my comments will speak exactly to Enid's brilliance, that we actually had an event on this 2 weeks ago. We had Eric Goldwyn from New York University who did the study on transit costs. He found exactly what you said, so you've been following along exactly right. We discussed these issues, and what I'll just say from Toronto's perspective, we are becoming both one of the most expensive jurisdictions to build transit, and we still find ways to have cost overruns on top of that. This is like the worst of all worlds. And what I worry about most is two things. One, we're just gonna run out of cash. Like, we can't keep doing this forever. And two, our public is gonna lose appetite and support for these really important projects that if you build them in the right place and you do it efficiently, can have huge impacts on our communities. And this speaks to the governance and the regionalism dynamics that Enid has been talking about through the Institute, that I think we need to be showing people that government plays a positive role, and infrastructure is so visible. And so when we screw these projects up, or they just cost way more than our peers in other countries like you described, it's starting to pose challenges for us. And I think now is the moment for us to get a handle on this. And Enid, you were ahead of the game by doing this even just a couple of weeks ago.
Yeah, sure. Okay, other questions? There are a couple at the back. Just as she's traveling, we'll be able to see this up close as we live in the East End. The Ontario line is about to be tunneled, like right through our neighborhood.
Right through our neighborhood.
Zack, go to Zack.
Yeah, sure. Start there and then.
Thank you for the presentation. I'm curious about surplus real estate that cities have and how you see that being utilized in the next 20 years and what that would look like in 2045.
Oh, God, no.
I can talk about this too. Why don't you go first?
Sure. I didn't realize it was directed to me. I think what we're seeing in municipalities right now is sort of a reconfiguration in terms of their capital mix. And I think that's partly why we're seeing, at least in some cases, properties come up as surplus because they're simply not needed anymore given the reconfiguration of, again, the capital mix. Certainly, from my practitioner perspective, I sit on the land management committee at the City of Kawartha Lakes, so we deal with exactly this issue when properties come up as potentially surplus. And I think on that committee, I'm about the most excited one to see these come up because my instinct is, yes, let's sell it, let's get rid of it, let's reinvest that money to help address our infrastructure backlog or in some other way.
Can I just add very quickly?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
I think here the City of Toronto deserves a real bit of praise and a tip of the cap. Toronto has been moving quickly now to try to get properties onto the market. What's happened is, I think, the recognition of the housing crisis, that we need more affordable housing, and it needs to be done quickly. And one way to do that is for the municipal contribution is through land. Municipalities don't have cash. We've heard that from everyone. But what they do have in many cases is really prime sites. Whether it's their parking authorities, like in Toronto, whether it's their parks and recreation buildings that are one story that could have stuff on top of them or on their parking lots, right across their portfolio. And to the City of Toronto's credit, they have scoured their portfolio. They've identified the top potential development sites, and they've created programs around them, both to move those projects more quickly, to include affordable housing on them, and to provide different types of funding waivers and even financial support to get those projects done. And that's starting to happen across the country because people have realized that public land is one of the major assets that we all own. This is our common wealth, and if it's used effectively, it can start to help address some of these issues around housing affordability that we're facing.
Okay. Great question. We had another one in the back, and then I think I saw a hand over here.
Hello, hi. My name is Zachary. I'm part of an organization called More Neighbors Toronto. We're a volunteer organization advocating for housing. And, going into this space, I remember thinking about the housing crisis. It's hugely dependent on the city's finances. And my question is about property taxes versus development charges. As you know, raising property taxes is really politically hard. Today's Toronto Star article came out with Olivia Child's budget saying that her property taxes are still high, but she's also raising, or the cities are also raising their development charges at the same time and at an exponential rate comparatively. And the question I have for you folks is, can you explain other tools that cities may use to get the things that they need financially, and help us kind of understand how we could make the case politically on development charges or stuff like that. I think the public is kind of getting a better understanding. I didn't know anything about development charges until a year ago, and I know Doug Ford and the province did a whole bunch of things that I still don't really understand what was going on. So maybe you could shed some light on that as well.
Take a first stab at it?
Well, I'll take a first stab. As I think I said in my remarks, cities don't have a lot of options when it comes to raising revenues. The property tax is the main source of revenue. That's true for cities across Canada. Toronto has the ability to levy some other taxes. One's a land transfer tax, so when you sell your property, there's a tax at that point. And then it has some smaller taxes, like an accommodation tax, which is a tax on hotels and motels. It has a vacant homes tax, but that's not designed so much to bring in revenues as it is to have people, rent their houses or live in their houses and not leave them vacant. So there's not a lot of choices on the tax side. They have user fees for things like water and transit and garbage collection, and then they have transfers from the other orders of government. Development charges are only allowed to be used for capital expenditure, so when you're building infrastructure in a new development or if you're doing a redevelopment. We have always talked about how growth should pay for growth, and development charges do that because it's a charge on the new development that presumably gets passed on to the new home buyer. It depends on the market conditions. More recently, and Adam's more familiar with the development charges debate, people don't like the notion that growth should pay for growth. Other levels of government are telling municipalities if they don't reduce their development charges, they won't get housing money. So they're very controversial. They weren't historically, but they certainly are now. But the point being that cities do a lot of things on a very limited number of revenues, and in many cases not appropriate revenues for the kinds of services they're delivering. So like social services on the property tax doesn't make a lot of sense.
And I think you raised an interesting point as well, just about the visibility of the property tax vis-a-vis some of those other types of tools. So we have time for maybe one more question. Did I see any other hands? I think this gentleman was next. Sorry, I gave you a long walk over.
And the next one's over there.
Yeah, hi, Walter Ross. I'm an accountant who's had lots of experience with taxation. Any chance that the Institute might take on the issue of what the federal provincial tax sharing agreements might look like in 10 years and 20 years from now, taking into account the fact that we've got 4 legitimate constituencies, Indigenous, municipal, provincial and federal, and really go at it from, I mean, it's a little bit simplistic, but efficiency is an important concept in taxation. You know, trying to get the most amount of money out of people with the least amount of pain. So finding efficient ways to finance the kinds of projects that John was talking about earlier. What about the Institute really taking that on?
Well, we've dabbled in that area. I think, you know, when we talk about cities getting income taxes or cities getting sales taxes, we don't mean that the city should levy its own income tax, because administratively that would make no sense. Same with the sales tax, although historically the city did have a sales tax back before the 1930s. It had an income tax, sorry, before the 1930s. We're talking about piggybacking onto the existing system. So, you know, you would piggyback onto the sales tax or onto the income tax. They would still be collected by the other levels of government and transferred to the municipalities. The issue for me is, when we talk about sharing, a lot of people say, well, just raise another 1% on the sales tax and give it to municipalities. Well, why would anyone do that? I mean, why would the province raise the tax, take all the flack for doing that, and then just give it to municipalities? Shouldn't municipalities say, look, we're Toronto, we need sales taxes, could you levy another 1% for us? We need you to collect it, but give us 1%. But another city might say, well, we just need 0.5%. And another city might say, we don't need it at all. The notion of 1% or a uniform amount that's just transferred to municipalities, likely on a per capita basis, or some sort of formula that bears no relationship to what they need, doesn't make a lot of sense to me. But that's a big issue, because when people say tax sharing, they mean give us a share of your revenues. And I don't think there's a lot of accountability in that. So we've done a little bit of that. We can certainly do some more. Taxation's what we do. One of the things we do.
Any final thoughts? Yeah.
Yep, I certainly do. I'd like to build on what Enid just mentioned. When you look at the overall property tax pie in general, all levels of government, property taxes in Ontario account for about 10%. So not a huge proportion. And so I think there's a very profound question that has not yet been answered in order to inform this discussion. And that question is it really true that the property tax is exhausted? And I may be at odds with some other folks in this room, but I'm not convinced that it is. And I haven't yet actually seen reliable evidence through empirical studies and so on to actually show that the property tax has been exhausted. So I think we need to answer that question first.
We actually did a study a number of years ago.
Oh, I know where you're going. I know where you're going with that.
We looked at revenue hills.
Yes.
You increase the property tax, you'll increase your revenues. You increase your property tax. At some point, you increase your property taxes, and your revenues go down because people leave or gets into the property value. And we found that for Toronto, they were below the peak of the revenue hill for residential, but not for commercial industrial. Other places in the GTA were a little different. It's out of date and should be redone, but there is a way to test for whether we have maxed out on the property tax.
So this sounds like a great topic for a glass of wine.
Yes.
It is.
Andrew, I'd just like to add one quick point. Just to that point on this whole capacity and when you hit it, because my doctoral thesis was done on, more recently, but on municipalities in the 1930s, and it was a completely different data set, but you had tax resistance at a certain point when the property tax reaches a certain point on measured against either the income of the household or even the values of the properties, and it's almost historically been around 3.5% to 4%, depending on whatever your base measurement comparison is. But it was a very interesting discovery to me when I looked at 1930s data with just having done the capacity Laffer curve study for IMFG. So there is a very good point there that it's not clear. There is really mixed empirical views on what's that capacity look like and whether it's exhausted. But that doesn't answer the question as to whether we can continue to rely on revenues from tangible taxation, given the shift in the overall structure of the economy.
Okay, a great place to leave it. I also think kind of an interesting, like, fitting place for an IMFG panel at 20 to lead things on the property tax. So big thank you to the panel and to all of you for the great questions. And we'll welcome up Shirley Hoy for the closing remarks.
Thank you, Andre. Great discussions, eh? So much information. But before we finish this part of the program, I would like to call on Thomas to come up, who's a former IMFG manager, to give his reflections on IMFG and our relationship to government. And then we'll be able to go and have a drink.
Thanks, Shirley. You probably will have noticed that I wasn't on the program. That's because Enid didn't want to be outdone by Taylor Swift, so she insisted there had to be special guests at this event. The plan kind of petered out after that because they only could find me, so it's like, no, but in all seriousness, I am extremely honored to be here today. The reason I did have to be a last-minute addition is that my partner is 39 weeks and 4 days and 16 hours, 55 minutes, probably 20 seconds pregnant right now, not that we're counting. But one benefit that the baby has, wisely decided to not come out into this winter weather is that I get to say a few words here. And I particularly want to talk a little bit about an aspect of IMFG that has been visible or has been talked about all day, and sort of kind of wrap it up that way. And it's very intimidating because, we've heard about how Enid's superpower is facilitating, but Enid's other superpower is wrapping up. So I'm going to have to try to do this. So when I speak about the fact that I worked at IMFG, to people in the municipal space, people immediately nod, and it's almost like, oh, okay, you're legitimate, you're Enid approved, and I immediately get this credibility that I don't think I entirely deserve, because I think what I've realized, and everyone talking here has really made this point, is that people think the IMFG is this huge enterprise, and at the end of the day, staff-wise, it's fairly small, but what it is a network of people that have come out of the Institute, that stay close to the Institute, and that continue to feed it and rejuvenate it and to push it forward. And so we just saw, in terms of who was on the stage, the former fellows, Zack Taylor, Gabe, Adam, Zach Spicer, people who started as fellows have continued their research, used the Institute to be able to continue their research on what they started from the very beginning in terms of municipal governance, in terms of multi-level governance, in terms of financing and development charters. You'll see at the reception that about where else the other fellows and former staff have gone, postdocs that have gone on to teach around the world. I think importantly, people who have come through the Institute who weren't necessarily finance and governance people. They may have been housing people. They may have been looking at environmental issues. And what the Institute offered was a way to have them take that work, continue it in their fields, knowing about municipal finance and governance in a way that they didn't before, and to have that inform their work. Gabe talked about the Who Does What series that we worked on together, and it was so important to have students be part of that. And part of that is because we knew that then they would go on to work at municipal governments, provincial governments, federal government, outside of government in public policy and other ways, and they would be able to bring this knowledge about municipal finance and governance that they learned through that experience and have it inform their work. And this talent development is extremely important, as the talent development that the Institute has done for academia, for the public sector, for the public policy world. It's one of its greatest impacts, I'd say. And part of it has to do that it has always managed to be that fulcrum between research and practitioner. And Gabe mentioned this as well, and it's been mentioned a few times on stage about the roundtables. And Maddie mentioned about being able to do that research that he did, and then to be able to be in a room a few weeks later after being published with someone from Infrastructure Ontario, with someone from the province, And it's a special aspect of this institute that the network, the community it's created, has always been inclusive of government, practitioners, not-for-profits, other organizations, knowing that the way for this research to have impact is for it to involve all those people. And so I want to just hopefully close things off by really highlighting that fact, because I think if you're around long enough, if an institute's around long enough, probably it will see people leave and it'll see people get fancy titles, and that's important, but that's not what's special here. What's special is what Selena started us off with at the beginning. People don't actually ever really leave. They keep coming back, and they become a new branch on the IMFG that keeps on growing. And so what I want to leave people with is that the real impact that IMFG has had is really in this room. It's the community that Enid and Alan have built here. And it's this community that means that there's ongoing discussion, like the ones we had today, about critical issues in our cities that don't have simple answers and that need continued exploration and that need people that are committed to investigating them. And that's what has made IMFG invaluable for 20 years and will make it invaluable for 20 more. So my time is up, and I think Selena and Andre will know that Enid's #1 rule about events is to finish on time. And apparently the baby still hasn't come, so I'm going to throw it back to Shirley, and we can go get some drinks.
Thank you, Thomas. That's a great summary. So my final job is to do a few thank yous just before I let you go into the reception. So I want to thank you to all the panelists, the discussants, the moderators, and to you, the engaged audience. That was a great discussion all around. Also, I want to thank the entire team at IMFG who organized this wonderful event. So thank you very much for everything you've done. And to the staff here at Monk School who support the event. Can't do it without you guys, Adam and crew and the whole team there. Also, it's really important. I think the one thing that Alan and Enid has done over the last 20 years is to continue to grow ongoing support for the Institute by the funders, including the City of Toronto, and Paul's here, the city manager's here. We've got Region of Peel, Region of York, Region of Halton, Region of Durham, Avana Capital, of course, and Maitrey. And then finally, a huge thank you to Alan and Enid for the first 20 years. And here's to the next 20 years. Many, many thanks. So now let's go to the reception.